The 9,460th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation concerning Western Sahara. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of council members to document S/2023/729, the report of the Secretary General on the situation concerning Western Sahara. Members of the council have before them document S/2023/802, the text of a draft resolution submitted by the United States of America. The council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/802 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 13 votes in favor, no votes against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2703/2023. Anyone speaking? Who's speaking? And I'll give the floor to those members of the council who wish to make statements after the vote. And I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States is pleased to see the council reaffirm its support for Personal Envoy de Mistura and for MONUSCO, led by SRSG Ivanko, with the adoption of this resolution. Today, this council sent a clear message that we must intensify efforts to advance an enduring and dignified resolution for Western Sahara without further delay. Although this resolution received widespread support, we regret that this council was not unanimous in renewing this mandate, as unity greatly enhances UN efforts to achieve peace. Colleagues, the United States strongly supports Personal Envoy de Mistura and his efforts to advance the political process. In adopting this resolution, members of the council underscored the urgent need for a successful political process. We again call on all parties to engage with the Personal Envoy in good faith and to work toward a sustainable political solution. A political solution is critical to promoting a peaceful and prosperous future for the people of Western Sahara and the region, and the United States continues to view Morocco's autonomy plan as serious, credible, realistic, and one potential approach to satisfying these aspirations. By renewing this mandate, this council has also affirmed the critical role of MONUSCO, which works to de-escalate tensions, monitor and report on the situation on the ground, and foster the conditions for the political process to advance. We welcome the progress made by MONUSCO in the resupply of its team sites to sustain these crucial operations. The continuation of safe and regular resupply operations and continued respect for MONUSCO's freedom of movement are vital. Colleagues, we remain deeply concerned by the humanitarian conditions in Tindouf, the poor living standards, threats to food security, and lack of access to basic services require a collective response. The United States, is the largest donor to this humanitarian response, is committed to doing our part, but we must all step up. People across Western Sahara and the region are counting on us. Today was a positive step, but we must continue to push progress forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique thanks the PNUD for their efforts. We wish to express our strong support for the work of the personal envoy of the Secretary General for Western Sahara, Mr. Stefan Mistura. In the same vein, we reiterate our support for the work of the United Nations Mission for Referendum in West Sahara, MINUSMA. MINURSO. Mr. President, Mozambique has approached the consultation process leading to the drafting of this resolution in an open and constructive manner, fully conscious and aware of the mandate of MINURSO as adopted by this Council. We therefore express our readiness to engage in negotiating process in good faith with the legitimate purpose of assisting MINURSO to return to its core objectives of implementing a referendum for self-autodetermination of the people of Western Sahara as provided by Resolution 690/1991 and subsequent decisions by this very chamber. It is our conviction that the resolution just adopted, it is a current form, will not assist the parties in achieving a just, lasting, and mutually accepted political solution as originally intended. To the contrary, it halts a gradual shift away from the mandate. It only postpones addressing core issues that need to be dealt with. We support all efforts aimed at just, lasting, and mutually acceptable political solutions that will provide for the self-determinations of people of Western Sahara in accordance with Security Council resolutions 69, 1754, 2414, 2468, 2494, 2548, 2602, and 2654. Our position is anchored in the Charter of the United Nations, which holds that all peoples should have unquestionable and inalienable right to self-determination. This principle was further espoused by General Assembly Resolution 1514 of 1960. As a country that was born from the hard exercising of its very right for ourselves, we hold this to be not only moral right, but also a right policy with a strong legal basis. We reaffirm our commitment to making every effort to help the parties to find a just, lasting, and mutual acceptable political solution based on compromise. But this has to be based on genuine efforts and with respect to every member constructive proposal. We reiterate our call to the parties to engage in a good faith with the Secretary General's personal envoy to achieve the long delay exercise of its right to self-determination by the people of Western Sahara. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Российская Федерация
The Russian
воздержалась по
Federation
подготовленному США
abstained
проекту
on
резолюции
the
Совета
draft resolution of the
Безопасности о
Security
продлении
Council prepared by
мандата
the USA,
миссии ООН
extending the
по
mandate
проведению
of the UN
референдума
mission
в
to the
Западной
referendum
Сахаре
in Western Sahara,
в связи с тем, что ни одно из наших
because not a single one
принципиальных
of
и
our
должным
principled
образом
and
обоснованных
properly
замечаний,
substantiated
в том числе
comments, including
компромиссного
those of a
характера,
compromised nature,
которые мы доводим
which
до
we have
американских
expressed
авторов
to the
уже не
American
первый год,
authors of several
так и не
years
было
now,
учтено.
were taken into account. None of them were taken into account.
По этой причине
For
представленная
that
сегодня
reason,
резолюция не
the
отражает
resolution
реальной ситуации
presented
на
today does
земле,
not reflect the real situation
сложившейся в
on the ground
западно-сахарском
that
урегулировании,
has taken shape in the
и
Western
вряд
Sahara
ли будет
settlement process,
способствовать
and will hardly
усилиям
do anything to
личного
support the efforts
посланника
of the
генсекретаря
personal
Стефана
envoy of the
Демистуры
Secretary
по
General Stefan de
возобновлению
Mistura
прямого
to
переговорного
resume
процесса
direct
между
negotiating
Марокко и
process between
фронтом
Morocco and the
Полисарио
Polisario
в
front
целях
in order
достижения
to achieve a
взаимоприемлемого
mutually
решения.
acceptable solution.
Господин председатель,
Mr.
начиная с
President,
2018 года
since
в
2018,
резолюции, продляющей мандат
resolutions
МООН
extending
РЗС,
MINURSO's mandate
вносятся изменения,
have
которые,
been
по нашим
amended in ways
соображениям,
that,
наносят
as we see
урон
it, do harm to
беспристрастному
the
и
impartial and
неангажированному подходу к
unbiased
проблеме
approach to
Западной
the problem
Сахары.
of Western Sahara.
Возникают расплывчатые
There is
формулировки,
vague wording emerging,
которые вызывают вопросы.
which raises questions,
Формулировки, определяющие
wording that
непосредственных участников
determines the
конфликта
direct
и
parties to
процесса
the conflict
западно-сахарского
and the
регулирования.
Western Sahara settlement process.
Неуместными нам видятся многочисленные ссылки
The many
на
references
утратившие
to the
актуальность
no
формат
longer
круглых
relevant
столов,
round table format are inappropriate as we
ограничивающий
see it. This
посредническую
format
деятельность
limits the
личного
mediating
посланника.
work of the personal envoy.
Мы с таким подходом не были согласны в прошлом,
We did not agree
не
with this
можем
approach in the
поддержать его
past, and we
и
cannot
сегодня.
support it today.
В этой связи хотели бы вновь
Therefore, we
подтвердить
would
нашу
once again like to
последовательную
confirm
позицию
our
по
consistent
западно-сахарскому
position on
регулированию.
the Western Sahara settlement process.
Выступаем за
We are in favor
сбалансированную и
of a balanced
непредвзятую
and
линию.
unbiased stance.
Поддерживаем усилия
We
личного
support the efforts
посланника
of the
по
personal
организации
envoy
прямых
to organize
переговоров между
direct
Марокко и
negotiations
фронтом
between
Полисарио.
Morocco and the Polisario front.
В таком ключе друзей
Council and a
Западной
member of the
Сахары
group of Friends of Western
продолжаем
Sahara,
активные
we
контакты
continue
со
our
всеми
active contacts
заинтересованными
with all
странами.
those interested parties.
Ведем работу с
We are
марокканцами,
working with the
полисарийцами,
Moroccans, the
алжирцами и
Polisario, the
мавританцами.
Algerians, and the Mauritanians.
Призываем все
We
стороны
call on all
воздерживаться
parties to
от
refrain
односторонних
from
действий, которые
unilateral
могли бы
actions
осложнить
which could
возобновление предметного политического
complicate a
диалога.
resumption of a focused political dialogue.
Конечная форма урегулирования
The ultimate
должна
formula for
основываться на
settlement must be based
взаимоприемлемых
on
развязках,
mutually
которые бы
acceptable
способствовали
solutions which
справедливому
would facilitate
политическому
a
разрешению
just
ситуации вокруг
political
Западной Сахары,
settlement of the situation surrounding Western Sahara
устраивающему как
that suits
марокканцев,
the
так и
Moroccans
полисарийцев,
and also the Polisario,
и
and
предусматривает
which
самоопределение народа
stipulates
Западной Сахары в
self-determination for the
рамках
people
процедур,
of Western Sahara
соответствующих
within
принципам и целям
procedures
Устава
that
ООН.
correspond to the principles and purposes of the UN
В
Charter.
заключение хотели бы
In
подчеркнуть, что
conclusion, we
наша
would like to
позиция
underscore that
сегодня
our position today
отражает
reflects
исключительно оценку
exclusively our assessment
недобросовестной
of
работы
the
неформальных
unscrupulous
кураторов
work of the
над
pen
представленным
holders
сегодня проектом.
on the draft that was
В
presented
очередной раз
today.
подтверждаются
Once
самые
again,
серьезные сомнения в отношении
our
беспристрастного
very
выполнения
serious doubts
неформальными
over the
кураторами
impartial
страновых сюжетов в
action
Совете
by
Безопасности,
the pen holders of the country subject to the Security
взятых на
Council,
себя обязанности.
the fulfilling of those obligations, our serious doubts are being borne out.
При этом мы
At the same
неизменно
time,
поддерживаем миссию
we
ООН в Западной
consistently
Сахаре,
support the UN mission in
играющую
Western
ключевую
Sahara, which plays a
стабилизирующую
key
роль
stabilizing
в плане
role
создания благоприятных
to
условий на
create
земле
conducive
для
conditions on the
возобновления
ground
диалога
for the
между
resumption
Марокко и
of
фронтом
dialogue between
Полисарио
Morocco and the Polisario front,
и продвижения
and
мирного
for advancing
процесса,
the peace process,
а также руководителя
and
миссии
also the head of the
Александра
mission,
Иванько.
Alexander Ivanko.
Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr.
多
President,
年来，
over the years,
联合国须发特派团
MINURSO
认真
has
履行
diligently
安理
fulfilled
会
its
授
council
权，
mandate
为维护
and
西
made
萨地
positive
区稳
contributions to
定，
maintaining
推
stability in
动政
Western
治解
Sahara and
决，做
promoting
出了
a
积极的
political
贡献。
settlement.
刚刚通过
The
的决议
resolution just
表明
adopted
了安理会
shows
支持
the
特派
Council's
团履
determination
职
to support the
和
mission
政治
in
解
the
决西萨
performance of
问
its
题的
duties
决
and to
心。
resolve politically the question of
中
Western
方高兴
Sahara.
地看到，
China is pleased
西
to
萨特派
see
团后
the
勤保
positive
障问
progress
题
made
取
on
得了
MINURSO's
积极的
logistical
进展。
support,
希望有
and
关
hopes
各方
that relevant
根据
parties
安理会
will
决
continue
议，
to strengthen
继续同
communication
特
and
派团
cooperation with the
加
mission
强
in
沟
accordance
通
with
合
Council
作，
resolutions
保障
to
特派
enable
团
the
履职。
mission to deliver on its mandate.
中方在西萨问
China's
题上的
position
立
on
场
question of
是
Western
一贯的、
Sahara is
明
consistent
确
and
的。
clear.
中方支持
China
以有
supports
关安
a
理会
just
决
and
议
a
为
lasting
基础，
solution
通
acceptable
过
to all
当事
parties
方
reached
平
through
等协商，
consultations
达
among
成
parties
公
as
公正、
equals
持
on the
久和
basis
各方
of the
均能接受的
relevant
解
Council
决方案。
resolutions.
中方支持
China
秘
supports
书长
the
个人
personal
特使
envoy
继续
of
加强
SG
斡旋努
in
力，
continuing to step up
在
mediation
深入了
efforts
解
to
各方
further
关切的基
progress
础
in the
上，
political process
推动
on
政
the
治进
basis
程
of an
取得
in-depth
更多
understanding
进
of
展。
the concerns of the parties.
中方希望
It is China's
安理
hope
会今
that
后
future
探讨西
Council
萨特派员
discussions
授权
on
问
the
题决议，
resolutions on MINUSO
能够
mandate
反映
can
形势
reflect the
最新
latest
变化。
changes of the
希
situation.
望执笔
We
国
also hope
推
that the
动安理
penholder
会
can
充
facilitate
分协商，
full consultation
争
over the
取形
Council
成
to
更为
garner
广泛的共识。
broader
谢谢主
consensus.
席。
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
la
President,
France se
France
félicite de
welcomes
l'adoption de
the
la
adoption of the
résolution qui
resolution which
renouvelle pour un
renews
an le
the
mandat de la
mandate of
MINURSO.
MINUSO for 1
Je
year.
souhaite rappeler le plein
First and
soutien de la
foremost,
France
I
aux
wish
efforts de
to
l'envoyé
reiterate France's
personnel
full
du
support
secrétaire
for the
général.
efforts of the
Sa
personal
récente
envoy of the
visite dans la
Secretary General.
région et les
His recent
consultations
visit
qu'il
to
a
the
pu
region
mener
and the
sont positives.
consultations that he led
Je salue
were a
également le
positive
travail de la
development. I also
MINURSO,
hail the
qui
work of
joue un rôle clé dans la
MINUSO that
stabilité de la
plays a
région et
key
contribue
role in
à créer
stabilizing
les
the region and
conditions
contributes to
nécessaires à la
creating
reprise du
the
processus
conditions
politique.
necessary for a resumption
Nous
of
nous
the political
félicitons de la
process.
reprise
We
des
also
opérations
welcome
de
the resumption
ravitaillement
of
des sites
resupply
d'observation de la
operations
MINURSO à
of
l'est du Berme
MINUSO
en
monitoring
septembre.
sites to
Une
the east of
reprise
the Berm in
pérenne reste
September.
toutefois
A lasting
nécessaire
resumption,
afin
however, remains
d'assurer ces
necessary
ravitaillements de
in order
façon
to
régulière.
guarantee
Il
regular
est également
resupply. It's
essentiel de
also
garantir la
essential
liberté de
to
mouvement de la
guarantee the
MINURSO.
freedom of movement
La
of
France
MINUSO.
rappelle sa
France
préoccupation à l'égard des
recalls its
violations du
concern
cessez-le-feu.
regarding
Elle appelle
ceasefire
les responsables de ces
violations. We
violations à
call for
pleinement
those
mettre en œuvre
responsible for these
l'accord de
violations to
cessez-le-feu
fully implement the
afin
ceasefire
de
agreement
faciliter la
in
poursuite
order
du
to facilitate
processus
the
politique. Monsieur
continuation
le
of the
Président,
political
la France
process. Mr.
défend
President,
une solution
France
politique
defends a
juste, durable
just,
et
lasting,
mutuellement
and mutually
acceptable,
acceptable political
conformément aux
solution in
résolutions
accordance
du
with
Conseil de
Security
sécurité. Je
Council
rappelle
resolutions.
le soutien
I
historique,
recall
clair et
the
constant de la
historic,
France au
clear,
plan
and
d'autonomie
constant support of
marocain.
France
Ce
for the
plan
Moroccan
est sur la
autonomy
table
plan.
depuis
That plan has
2007.
been on the table
Il est
since
temps désormais
2007. It
d'avancer.
is now time
Dans
to
cette
move forward
perspective,
with it. In
la
this
France
vein,
encourage toutes les
France
parties à
encourages all
s'engager en vue d'une
parties to
solution
commit to
pragmatique,
finding a
réaliste, durable et
practicable,
fondée sur le
realistic,
compromis
enduring
et
solution
soutient
based on
les efforts de
compromise.
l'envoyé
We
personnel
support the
en
efforts
vue
of
de la
the personal
reprise des tables
envoy in order to
rondes.
ensure a
Je vous
resumption of the
remercie, Monsieur
round
le Président.
tables. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le
Thank
Gabon a
you, Mr.
voté en
President.
faveur du
We
renouvellement
voted
pour
in
un
favor
an
of the one my
au
country's
processus
support
politique
for the
visant à
political
parvenir à une
process, aiming
solution
to
politique
achieve a
pragmatique,
political
réaliste,
solution which is
réalisable
practicable
et
and
fondée
realistic,
et durable,
feasible
fondée sur le
and
compromis
lasting
à
based
la
on
situation au Sahara
compromise,
occidental.
a solution that is to
Comme
the
nous l'avons
situation in the
indiqué
Western Sahara.
pendant
As
les
we
négociations, il
indicated
s'agit
during
d'une résolution
negotiations, this
équilibrée
is a
qui
balanced
tient compte des
resolution which
attentes
takes
de toutes
account
les
of the
parties,
expectations of
permettra
all
de
parties.
soutenir les
It will make
efforts
it
de
possible
l'envoyé
to support
personnel
the efforts of the personal
Staffan de
envoy, Staffan de
Mistura
Mistura,
en vue de la relance
in
du
order
processus
to
politique
allow the
entre les
resumption of the
différentes
political
parties.
process between
Cet
the
élan
various
diplomatique
parties.
de
This
l'envoyé
diplomatic
personnel mérite
momentum
d'être
ushered in by the
capitalisé
personal envoy
par la
must be
reprise du
built
processus de
upon,
table ronde
because the resumption
avec
of the
l'ensemble
roundtable
des
process
protagonistes.
with all
Le
key
vote du Gabon
players
traduit également notre soutien
is
à
important.
l'initiative
We
marocaine
also
d'autonomie
support the
qui
Moroccan
présente
autonomy
des
plan, which
perspectives
presents
crédibles et
credible
rassurantes
horizons,
permettant non
reassuring
seulement de
perspectives,
mettre
which
fin à
will make it
l'impasse
possible
actuelle,
not only to
mais
put an
aussi de
end to the
parvenir à
current
une
state of
solution
gridlock,
politique
but also
juste,
to reach a
durable, mutuellement
political
acceptable.
solution which is
Enfin,
just,
nous
lasting, and
encourageons le
mutually
Royaume du
acceptable.
Maroc
Finally, we
à
encourage the
poursuivre
Kingdom of
ses
Morocco
efforts
to
en vue de
continue
la
its
préservation
efforts
du
in order
cessez-le-feu
to preserve
et du
the
renforcement de
ceasefire
sa
and to
coopération
strengthen
avec la
its
MINURSO.
cooperation
Nous
with
appelons toutes
MINUSO.
les autres
We call
parties
upon
à
all
faire de
other
même dans
parties
l'intérêt
to
de la
do the same
sécurité et
thing
de la
in the
stabilité dans
interest of
l'ensemble de la
security and
région. Je vous
stability
remercie.
throughout the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس
Mr.
بداية
President, at the outset,
ترحب دولة الإمارات باعتماد
we
قرار اليوم
welcome the
الذي
adoption of
يمدد
today's
ولاية
resolution
بعثة
that
مينورسو لمدة
renews
عام
the mandate of
ونشكر
MINUSO for an
الولايات
additional
المتحدة
year. We
بصفتها
thank
حامل
the
القلم
United States, the
وكذلك أعضاء
penholder,
المجلس
and the
على
members of the Security
انخراطهم
Council
البناء خلال
for
المفاوضات.
positively engaging
لقد
during
صوتت
the
دولة
consultation
الإمارات
process.
لصالح هذا
The
القرار
UAE voted in favor
لتوازن
of this
نصه
resolution because
وشموليته
it has a balanced,
ولأخذه
comprehensive
بعين
text, and
الاعتبار
it takes
التطورات
into
المهمة
account
التي
the
طرأت
important developments
على
that
هذا
took
الملف
place
منذ العام الماضي،
since last
ومنها
year,
المشاورات غير
including
الرسمية
the
التي
informal
أجراها
consultations
المبعوث
that
الشخصي
took place
للأمين العام
between
السيد
the
ستيفان دي
personal
مستورا.
envoy, Mr. Stefan de Mistura.
إن قرار اليوم يبرز دعم
Today's
المجلس المستمر
resolution shows
لبعثة
the
مينورسو
support
وجهود
of the
المبعوث
Council to
الشخصي
MINURSO and the
الرامية
efforts of the Special
لإحراز
Envoy
تقدم
in
في
order
العملية
to
السياسية
make
برعاية
progress in the
الأمم
political
المتحدة.
process that is facilitated
وبما
by
أن
the UN.
هذا هو آخر اجتماع
As this
مجدول
is the
بشأن
last
هذه
meeting
القضية
scheduled for
خلال
this
عضوية دولة
issue
الإمارات في
during
مجلس
our
الأمن،
mandate at the
أود
Security
التأكيد
Council,
على ثلاث
I would
نقاط.
like to reaffirm the
أولاً،
following 3 points.
يتعين علينا
One,
مواصلة
we must
دعم
continue
جهود
to
المبعوث
support the
الشخصي
efforts of
لتمهيد
the Special
الطريق أمام
Envoy
إعادة
in
إطلاق
order to pave the
المفاوضات،
way for
ونرى
a
بأن
relaunch
استئناف
of
صيغة
negotiations. We
المائدة
believe that
المستديرة
the
بمشاركة كافة
roundtable
الأطراف
format with the
سيساهم في
participation
كسر
of
الجمود
all parties
السياسي.
will help break the political
ونشدد في هذا
impasse.
الصدد
We stress
على
in
أن
this
مبادرة
regard
الحكم
that
الذاتي
the
التي قدمتها
autonomy
المملكة
initiative
المغربية
provided
والتي
by the
وصفتها
Kingdom of
قرارات مجلس
Morocco
الأمن
and that was
منذ
described
2007
or
بأنها
mentioned
تتسم
by UN
بالجدية
Security Council
والمصداقية
resolutions as
هي الأساس
serious
الوحيد للتوصل
and
إلى حل
legitimate. This
سياسي
is the only
عادل
way to
ودائم
reach a
وعملي
last,
ومتوافق
durable,
عليه.
and pragmatic political
ثانياً،
solution that
أن
is
تمكين بعثة
mutually
مينورسو
acceptable.
من
Second,
إعادة
enabling
تموين
MINURSO to
مواقعها بشكل
resupply its
مستدام
sites
وليس
in a
فقط
sustainable
على
manner
أساس
and not
استثنائي،
just on an
أمر
exceptional
ضروري
basis.
لتمكين
This is
البعثة من
necessary
تنفيذ
to allow
ولايتها بشكل فعال.
MINURSO to carry out its mandate in an effective
ونشيد
manner.
في هذا الصدد
In this regard,
بتعاون
we
المملكة
commend
المغربية مع
the
البعثة
cooperation
والتزامها
between
بوقف إطلاق
MINURSO
النار.
and the Kingdom of
ونرى
Morocco
أنه
and
على
their support
جبهة
for the ceasefire.
البوليساريو
We believe
التعاون
that the
بشكل كامل
Polisario
مع
front
بعثة
should
مينورسو
cooperate
وإزالة
fully
كافة
with
القيود
MINURSO and
التي
should remove
تؤثر
all
على عمل
obstacles
البعثة
that could
وإعادة
impact the work
الالتزام
of
بوقف إطلاق النار.
the mission and to
وأخيرا، تؤكد دولة
commit
الإمارات
to
على
the
دعمها
ceasefire.
الثابت
In
للمملكة
conclusion,
المغربية
we
وسيادتها على
reaffirm
كامل
our
الصحراء
support to the
المغربية،
Kingdom of
ونشدد على
Morocco
عدم
and its
المساس بوحدتها
sovereignty
الترابية،
over the Moroccan
ونتطلع إلى مواصلة
Sahara.
الأمم المتحدة
We look
جهودها
forward for the
البناءة
UN to
من أجل
continue
التوصل
its
إلى حل
constructive
لهذا
efforts
الوضع
in order
المستمر منذ
to reach a
العقود،
solution
الأمر
for
الذي
this
سيساهم
issue that
أيضا
lasted
في
for
تعزيز
decades, and
الاستقرار
this will help
والأمن في المنطقة
strengthen
التي تعاني من
security and
تحديات
stability in the region,
عديدة. وشكرا
a region
سيد
that
الرئيس.
is facing many challenges. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. The 9,461st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is identical letters dated 19th January 2016 from the permanent representative of Colombia to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General and the President of the Security Council, S/2016/53. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2023/701, the report of the Secretary General on the United Nations Verification Mission in Colombia. Members of the Council have before them document S/2023/808, the text of a draft resolution submitted by the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/701 2023/808 please raise their hand. The draft resolution has been adopted unanimously as Resolution 2704, 2023. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank colleagues for the constructive engagement during negotiations. The United Kingdom welcomes this consensus adoption, which sends a strong signal of support for the peace process in Colombia. And as Women, Peace and Security High-Level Week draws to a close, it is fitting that this Council has recognized the efforts of the UN verification mission to incorporate gender as a cross-cutting issue in implementing its mandate and ensuring adequate gender expertise. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, the A3 welcomes the unanimous adoption of the resolution on the expansion of the mandate of the United Nations Verification Mission in Colombia, presented by the United Kingdom, to whom we thank for their dedicated effort in conducting the negotiations to reach a consensual text. The vote in favor of this resolution reiterates our commitment to supporting the government and the Colombian people towards building a stable and lasting peace. Guided by the trust that Colombia has placed in the United Nations to verify the implementation of the peace agreement in the country, and given the remarkable achievements registered so far in the negotiations with the National Liberation Army, ELN, we are committed to supporting the mission in its continued monitoring and verification of the ceasefire agreement between the government of Colombia and the Estado Mayor Central, contingent on the necessary conditions set forth by the Secretary General. We'll continue to monitor and encourage further advancement of the ethnic chapter of the peace agreement, an important component of the agreement which will go far in re-establishing justice and equality for all Colombian people, including Afro-Colombians and indigenous people. In concluding, the A3 will continue to offer its unwavering support to the verification mission and the special representative as they diligently monitor and enforce compliance with the commitments of the Colombian peace agreement. Their exemplary performance in this role deserves acknowledgement and reinforces our commitment to their ongoing efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. We are pleased the Council came together today to unanimously extend the mandate of the UN verification mission in Colombia for another 12 months. We are particularly delighted that a reference to the importance of including youth in the peace process was reflected. As the driving force of the future, the voices and the active participation of youth should be protected, respected, and promoted for the peace process to be sustainable. Protection for young community members and leaders is needed to ensure their full and effective participation in peace-building efforts. The need to provide protection of young community members and leaders to ensure their full and effective participation in peace-building efforts was also part of the advice from the Peace-Building Commission to the Security Council. And this practice will strengthen relations between the PBC and the Council, which Japan believes is important. We hope that such good practices will be enhanced. We also welcome the emphasis on the efforts of the UN verification mission to continue to integrate a gender perspective as a cross-cutting issue into its work, among other perspectives. To conclude, Japan reaffirms its firm support for the work of the UN verification mission and will remain committed to supporting the peace process and the peace-building efforts in Colombia. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Brazil. I'll speak in Spanish. Estimados colegas,
Distinguished colleagues,
Brasil felicita a
Brazil
los miembros del
congratulates the
Consejo de
members
Seguridad
of the
por
Security
la adopción
Council on
unánime de la
the
renovación
unanimous
del mandato
adoption
de la
of the
misión de
mandate
verificación de
renewal
Naciones
for the
Unidas en
United
Colombia.
Nations Verification Mission in
Brasil
Colombia.
agradece al Reino
Brazil
Unido por su
thanks the
excelente
United Kingdom
labor
for
como
its
relator.
sterling work as
La
penholder.
tarea del Consejo
The
de
work of
Seguridad
the
en
Security
Colombia
Council in Colombia
responde y debe
is in
siempre
line with and must
responder a las
always be in
necesidades y
line with the
prioridades
needs
de
and
Colombia,
priorities of
tal
Colombia
como
as
expresadas por su
expressed by
gobierno.
its government.
En ese
In this
sentido,
connection,
nos
we are
complace
delighted
reconocer que la
to
resolución
note that
adoptada
the
hoy
resolution
refleja
adopted
plenamente la
today
voluntad
fully
soberana
reflects
de
the
ese
sovereign
país.
will of that country.
Brasil apoya la
Brazil
estrategia del
supports the
gobierno Petro
strategy
para
of
alcanzar
the
una paz
Petro
total.
government to achieve a total
Reconocemos la
peace. We
importancia y la
recognize the
necesidad de
importance
los
of and the
diálogos
need for
adicionales
the
que
additional
se están
dialogues that are
realizando para
underway
expandir los
to
beneficios
spread
de la paz
the
en todo el
dividends of
país.
peace throughout the country in
Seguimos
its
con interés
entirety.
y
We
optimismo
continue to
el
follow with
diálogo del
interest and
gobierno con el
optimism the
autoproclamado
dialogue of
Grupo
the
Estado
government with
Mayor
the
Central.
self-proclaimed group
Como en el
Estado
caso
Mayor
de
Central,
ELN,
EMC. As in the
esperamos
case
que el
with the
Consejo
ELN, we
pueda
hope that the
autorizar que la
Council will be
misión
able
verifique la
to
implementación del
authorize the mission
acuerdo de
to
cese al
verify the
fuego con el
implementation of
ELC
the ceasefire
cuando
agreement
se
with the
alcance el grado
EMC
de
when the
madurez
necessary
necesario.
degree of maturity
Es
has been
importante
reached on this front.
optimizar la
It is
contribución
important
del
to
Consejo
optimize the
al avance
contribution that the
conjunto de
Council
los
makes
distintos
to
procesos de
progress
negociación en
across
Colombia,
the various
sobre
negotiation
todo con el
processes
objetivo de
underway in
incentivar
Colombia,
los
with the
ceses al
ultimate
fuego,
goal of encouraging
tanto con el
ceasefires,
gobierno
both
como
with the
entre los
government
grupos
and
que aún
between the
disputan
groups that
territorios.
continue to be engaged in
El
territorial
proceso de paz en
disputes.
Colombia es un
The peace
ejemplo para el
process in
mundo
Colombia is an
de cómo
example for the world
priorizar
of
e
how to
integrar la
prioritize
perspectiva
and
de mujeres,
incorporate the perspective
paz y
of women,
seguridad.
peace, and security
La misión de
into
verificación
work.
en Colombia
The
debe también
verification mission in
reflejar
Colombia
esta
must
realidad.
also reflect that reality,
Asegurar la
guaranteeing the
incorporación de una
integration of a
perspectiva de
gender
género
perspective
en
in each
cada faceta
facet
del
of the
trabajo para la
work
construcción y
underway to build
consolidación de
and
la paz
consolidate
es
peace is
esencial
vital
para alcanzar
to
soluciones
achieve
más amplias
broader
y
and
sostenibles.
sustainable solutions.
No se trata de añadir
We're
tareas,
not
sino de
adding
mejorar la
work to
calidad
a
de nuestro
mandate, but
enfoque
what we're
hacia el
doing
proceso
is
de paz.
strengthening the quality of our
Abordar
approach,
cuestiones
the approach
esenciales
that
para la
is that
paz en
we
Colombia,
adopt for the peace
desde la
processes,
reforma rural
tackling
hasta la
issues crucial
reintegración
to
de
peace in Colombia,
excombatientes,
from rural
a
reform
través
to
de
the
un enfoque
reincorporation of
sensible
former
al género,
combatants, using a
enriquece los
gender-sensitive
esfuerzos
approach
y
enriches
solidifica la
our work
base para
and
una paz
strengthens the
duradera en ese
foundations
país.
for a lasting peace in the country.
Felicitamos una vez
Once
más
again,
al
we
pueblo y al gobierno de
congratulate the
Colombia
people
por sus
and government for
persistentes
Colombia on
esfuerzos
their
para
tireless
buscar,
efforts to seek,
alcanzar y
achieve,
consolidar la
and
paz
consolidate
total en todo
total
su
peace
territorio.
across its
La
territory.
paz es el único
Peace is
camino
the only
posible
path
para
possible
asegurar la
to guarantee
prosperidad
the
y la
prosperity
ciudadanía de
and the
todos los
peaceful
colombianos.
civic coexistence of
La
all
renovación
Colombia's
del
people.
mandato de
The
la misión de
renewal of
verificación
the
por el Consejo de
verification
Seguridad
mission's mandate
es
by
una
the Security
invaluable
Council
contribución para
is
el
an
éxito
invaluable
definitivo
contribution
en
to
este
the
complejo
lasting
pero
success of this
imperioso
vital but
camino que
crucial
recorre
journey
Colombia.
that Colombia has
Muchas
embarked
gracias.
upon. I thank you.
I resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
162nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel and Jordan to participate in this meeting. It's so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invited the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Filippi Lazzarini, Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, Ms. Catherine Russell, Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Fund, and Ms. Lisa Dothan, Director of the Humanitarian Financing and Resourcing Mobilization Division of the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It's so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Filippi Lazzarini.
Mr. President, member of the Council, the last 3 weeks have been horrific. Almost everyone in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, and the broader region is in mourning. The horrific attacks by Hamas in Israel on October 7 were shocking. The relentless bombardment by the Israeli forces of the Gaza Strip are shocking. The level of destruction is unprecedented. The human tragedy unfolding under our watch is unbearable. 1 million people, half the population of Gaza, were pushed from the north of the Gaza Strip toward the south in 3 weeks. The south, however, has not been spared from bombardment, with significant number killed. I have said many times, and I will say it again, no place is safe in Gaza. Now, civilians remaining in the north are receiving evacuation notices from the Israeli forces, urging them south to receive scarce humanitarian assistance. But many, including pregnant women, people with disabilities, the sick and the wounded, are unable to move. What happened and continues to happen is forced displacement. Over 670,000 displaced people are now in overcrowded UNRWA schools and buildings. They live in appalling, unsanitary conditions with limited food and water, sleeping on the floor without mattresses or outside in the open. Hunger and despair are turning into anger against the international community, and in Gaza, the international community is better known as UNRWA. Mr. President, nearly 70% of those reported killed are children and women. Save the Children reported yesterday that nearly 3,200 children were killed in Gaza in just 3 weeks. This surpasses the number of children killed annually across the world's conflict zones since 2019. This cannot be collateral damage. Churches, mosques, hospitals, and UNRWA facilities, including those sheltering displaced people, have not been spared. Too many people have been killed and injured while seeking safety in places protected by international humanitarian law. The current siege imposed on Gaza is collective punishment. 2 weeks of full siege followed by the trickle of aid last week mean that basic services are crumbling. Medicine is running out. Food and water are running out. Fuel is running out. The streets of Gaza have started overflowing with sewage, which will cause a massive health hazard very soon. In the latest blow, the communication blackout over the weekend has aggravated the panic and distress of people. The blackout meant that people could not communicate with their loved ones inside Gaza to know who is dead or who is alive. They no longer knew whether they would receive bread from UNRWA. They felt abandoned and cut off from the rest of the world. The communication blackout has accelerated the breaking down of civil order. Panic pushed thousands of desperate people to head to the UNRWA warehouses and distribution center, where we store the food and other supply we started receiving via Egypt last week. A further breakdown in civil order will make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the largest UN agency in Gaza to continue operating. It will also make it impossible to bring in convoys. I say this while being fully aware that UNRWA is the last remaining lifeline for the Palestinian people in Gaza. Member of the Council, UNRWA is calling on you for support. I lost 64 colleagues in just over 3 weeks. The last tragic passing confirmed was 2 hours ago. Samir, head of security and safety in the Middle region, was killed with his wife and 8 children. This is the highest number of UN aid workers killed in a conflict in such a short time. My 13,000 colleagues in Gaza are from a community of 1.7 million Palestinian refugees out of 2.2 million residents in the Gaza Strip. Those who are alive have, for the most part, lost relatives, friends, neighbors, and are displaced like the majority of Gazans. Many of my own colleagues now live, sleep, and work in UNRWA shelters. And yet, they are showing exceptional dedication to UN value. No one can do justice to thousands of UNRWA staff who continue to work tirelessly to support their communities. These are teachers, doctors, social workers, engineers, and support staff. They are mother and father. If they were not in Gaza, they could have been your neighbor, your friends. And they are operating 150 UNRWA shelters. They are keeping 1/3 of our health center open and run 80 mobile health teams. They support the entry of humanitarian convoys and the storage and distribution of aid. They distribute the little fuel we have left to hospitals, bakeries, and shelters. My UNRWA colleagues are the only glimmer of hope for the entire Gaza Strip, a ray of light as humanity sinks into its darkest hour. But they are running out of fuel, out of water, out of food and medicine, and will soon be unable to operate. Let me be clear, the handful of convoys being allowed through Rafah is nothing compared to the needs of over 2 million people trapped in Gaza. The system in place to allow aid into Gaza is geared to fail unless there is political will to make the flow of supplies meaningful, matching the unprecedented humanitarian needs. Mr. President, Gaza has over 2 million people, half of them children. Gazans are vibrant, educated people who aspire to have normal lives, families, children, education, and dreams of a better future. Today, Gazans feel that they are not treated as other civilians. Most of them feel trapped in a war they have nothing to do with. They feel the world is equating all of them to Hamas. This is dangerous, and we know this too well from previous conflicts and crises. An entire population is being dehumanized. The atrocities of Hamas do not absolve the state of Israel from its obligation under international humanitarian law. Every war has rules, and this one is no exception. Hannah Arendt said, "The death of human empathy is one of the first and most revealing signs of a culture that is about to fall into barbarity. More than ever, Gazans deserve our empathy. Its absence will deepen the polarization in the region and further push away any prospect of peace." Mr. President, while a lot of the focus is on Gaza, I wish to reiterate that another crisis is unfolding in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The United Nations has been sounding the alarm for months on the increased violence. Palestinian fatalities this year are the highest since the UN started to keep record in 2005. At least 115 Palestinians have been killed since October 7, including 33 children. The movement restrictions imposed across the West Bank are impacting our services, including schools and health centers. Meanwhile, the situation on the Israeli-Lebanese border is getting worse, with regular exchanges of fires and civilian casualties reported. In conclusion, I'm very worried about the potential spillover of this conflict beyond Gaza unless the following is enforced. First, there must be strict adherence to international humanitarian law. This means civilian and civilian infrastructure, including UN premises, school, hospital, places of worship, and shelter hosting civilian, must be protected all over the Gaza Strip, north and south, and at all times. This is not an option, it is an obligation. Second, we need a safe, unimpeded, substantial, and continuous flow of humanitarian aid, including fuel, into the Gaza Strip and across it. For this, we need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Third, UNRWA still needs funds. We have the necessary and largest presence on the ground. We can deliver if we have the means and the resources, including the finances to pay staff on the front lines. UNRWA has received generous contribution towards its initial flash appeal, but without a fully funded core budget, we cannot pay salaries and deliver. Finally, in these dark times, we must not lose sight of our humanity. Our empathy should apply to all, Palestinian, Israeli, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. The rules of law or of war must be followed by all parties at all times, in all places. Civilians must be protected, hostages released, and a genuine humanitarian response facilitated. An immediate humanitarian ceasefire has become a matter of life and death for millions. The present and future of Palestinian and Israeli depend on it. I urge all member states to change the trajectory of this crisis and work towards a genuine political solution before it's too late. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Lazzarini for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Catherine Russell.
Thank you to Ambassador Nusseibeh and Ambassador Franca Danesi for convening this meeting, and to members of the Security Council for this opportunity to speak about the humanitarian situation in the state of Palestine and Israel. At UNICEF, we firmly believe that the true cost of this latest escalation will be measured in children's lives, those lost to the violence and those forever changed by it. After little more than 3 weeks, the devastating tally is quickly adding up, with rampant grave violations being committed against children. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, more than 8,300 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including over 3,400 children, with over 6,300 children injured. This means that more than 420 children are being killed or injured in Gaza every day, a number that should shake each of us to our core. Of course, the violence being perpetrated against children extends beyond the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, at least 37 children have reportedly been killed. And of course, more than 30 Israeli children have reportedly been killed, while at least 20 children remain hostage in the Gaza Strip, their fates unknown. Civilian infrastructure has also come under fierce attack. According to the World Health Organization, in Gaza, 34 attacks have been reported against healthcare facilities, including 21 hospitals. 12 of Gaza's 35 hospitals, which are also being used as shelters for displaced people, can no longer function. At least 221 schools and more than 177,000 housing units have been damaged or destroyed. Meanwhile, what little clean water remains in Gaza is quickly running out, leaving more than 2 million people in dire need. We estimate that 55% of water supply infrastructure requires repair or rehabilitation. Only one desalination plant is operating at just 5% capacity, while all 6 of Gaza's water waste treatment plants are now non-operational due to a lack of fuel or power. The lack of clean water and sanitation is on the verge of becoming a catastrophe. Unless access to clean water is urgently restored, more civilians, including children, will fall ill or die from dehydration or waterborne diseases. As if this wasn't enough, children in both Israel and the state of Palestine are experiencing terrible trauma, the consequences of which could last a lifetime. Studies have shown that violence and upheaval can induce toxic stress in children that interferes with their physical and cognitive development and causes mental health problems over both the short and the long terms. We are doing our best to reach all children in need, but the delivery of humanitarian aid, especially in Gaza, is now extremely challenging. This is due to both the current siege conditions imposed on Gaza and the highly dangerous circumstances under which our staff are operating. Some of our staff have lost close family members, including spouses and children. And of course, we are grieving with UNRWA for their staff members who have been killed. 2 days ago, we lost contact with our colleagues in Gaza when telecommunications were disrupted. This left them at even greater risk, and it made their work to help children even harder to accomplish. Excellencies, UNICEF and our partners are committed to staying on the ground to deliver for children. But make no mistake, the situation grows worse by the hour, and without an urgent end to the hostilities, I am deeply afraid for the fate of the region's children. But we and you have the power to help lift children out of this spiral of violence. I implore the Security Council to immediately adopt a resolution that reminds parties of their obligations under international law, that calls for a ceasefire, that demands the parties allow safe and unimpeded humanitarian access, that demands the immediate and safe release of all abducted children, and that urges parties to afford children the special protection to which they are entitled. The Security Council should prioritize what is now a worsening displacement crisis with more than 1.4 million people in Gaza, the majority of whom are children now displaced. As the Secretary General has said, the order for 1.1 million Palestinian civilians to leave northern Gaza should be rescinded. Demands for hospital evacuations should also cease, given their protected status under international humanitarian law. All parties must stop violence and prevent any grave violations committed against children. We must have humanitarian access through all crossing points into the Gaza Strip through safe and efficient supply routes. And parties must ensure the safe and unimpeded movement of humanitarian supplies and personnel throughout the Gaza Strip for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, including but not limited to food, water, medicines, fuel, and electricity. Finally, measures to prevent electricity, food, water, and fuel from entering Gaza from Israel must be immediately reversed so that civilians have access to the services they need to survive. Excellencies, UNICEF was created almost 77 years ago out of the ashes of World War II. Since then, our commitment to our mission has never wavered. We advocate for the rights of every child. On behalf of all the children caught in this nightmare, we call on the world to do better. Whether they are young people attending a music festival or children going about their daily lives in Gaza, they all deserve peace. Children do not start conflicts, and they are powerless to stop them. They need all of us to put their safety and security at the forefront of our efforts, and to imagine a future where children are healthy, safe, and educated. No child deserves any less. Thank you.
I thank Mrs. Russell for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mrs. Lisa Dufton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of Emergency Relief Coordinator and Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Martin Griffiths, who is currently on mission in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. The events that have unfolded since 7 October have been nothing short of devastating and heartbreaking. We do not forget the 1,400 people killed and thousands more injured and taken in the brutal Hamas attack. Indiscriminate rocket fire continues from Gaza into populated areas of Israel, causing more civilian casualties and displacement and trauma. We deplore that 230 people held hostage in Gaza. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. We welcome all diplomatic efforts to secure their release and demand that, in the interim, they be treated humanely and be allowed to receive visits from the International Committee of the Red Cross. As you've just heard from Commissioner General Lazzarini, the situation for the more than 2 million people trapped in the Gaza Strip is catastrophic. They've now endured a siege and continuous bombardment for 23 days. According to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, more than 8,000 people have been killed, 66% of whom are said to be women and children. Tens of thousands more have been injured. The scale of the horror people are experiencing in Gaza is really hard to convey. People are becoming increasingly desperate as they search for food, water, and shelter amid the relentless bombing campaign that's wiping out whole families and entire neighborhoods. In their desperation, people have resorted to breaking into UN warehouses in search of food and water. Dehydration is an increasing concern, as is the possibility of the spread of disease and other health concerns due to unsafe water and breakdown in sewage treatment services. More than 1.4 million people are internally displaced in Gaza, and hundreds of thousands of children, women, and men are crammed into overcrowded shelters and hospitals. Many of these people have moved south in search of safety. But the reality is that nowhere is safe, and we simply don't have enough essential supplies to provide for the survival of internally displaced people at this scale. As we heard from Executive Director Russell, the healthcare system is in tatters. Patients lie on the floors and in corridors. Surgeons are operating without anesthesia. Out of an estimated 50,000 pregnant women, 5,500 are due to deliver within the next 30 days. For the 1,000 patients dependent on dialysis and the 130 premature babies in incubators, life hangs by a thread as hospital backup generators run on fumes. Some 9,000 cancer patients are not receiving adequate care. We're deeply concerned by allegations of military installations in the close vicinity of hospitals and the request by Israeli authorities for hospitals, including Al-Quds and Shifa, to be evacuated. There's nowhere safe for these patients to go. And for those on life support and babies in incubators, moving would almost certainly be a death sentence. Mr. President, the provision of humanitarian relief is extremely complex and challenging due to the bombardment, the destruction of infrastructure, and as we've said repeatedly, the lack of fuel. We mourn the loss of 64 UNRWA colleagues and other humanitarian staff who've been tragically killed, and we extend our deepest condolences to the families and colleagues. We have the utmost admiration for the bravery, selflessness, and commitment of humanitarian workers who are delivering aid to those in need in this perilous environment. Mr. President, we welcome the agreement that has allowed us to get some relief into Gaza via the Rafah border crossing, but these deliveries are a drop in the ocean compared to the vast scale of needs. It's imperative that we're able to get humanitarian supplies and relief into Gaza safely, reliably, without impediment, and at the scale required. In particular, urgent for us to replenish fuel supplies, which are vital for powering most essential services, including hospitals and water desalination plants, and to transport humanitarian relief inside Gaza. And more than one entry point into Gaza is indispensable if we are to make a difference. Karim Shalom between Israel and Gaza is the only crossing equipped to rapidly process a sufficiently large number of trucks. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, scores of civilians have been killed and incidents of settler violence have increased, causing hundreds of civilians to be displaced. Likewise, the violence and closure of checkpoints has impeded access to essential services and food distribution. the permits of some 150,000 to 175,000 Palestinians from the West Bank working in Israel and settlements are now suspended. The situation is causing significant damage to the West Bank economy and Palestinian institutions. We have very real fears about what lies ahead. The current situation may pale in comparison with what is to come. There's a genuine risk that this war could escalate further and spill over into wider region. We must take urgent collective action to prevent this. Mr. President, in light of all that has been described today, what we're calling for is for the parties to agree to pause the fighting on humanitarian grounds. It would provide the required calm and safety for hostages to be released and for the UN to replenish supplies, relieve exhausted personnel, and resume assistance throughout Gaza wherever civilians are in need. It would also provide much-needed respite to civilians who are living under unimaginably traumatic conditions. But with or without a pause in the fighting, I reiterate that all parties on all sides must respect international humanitarian law. This means allowing relief in and taking constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarian and medical workers, facilities, and assets. And this applies whether civilians move or they stay. We are relying on the responsibility of every member state here and across the UN to use all of their influence to ensure that the rules of war are respected and that as far as is possible, civilians are spared further suffering. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Dufton for her briefing. And I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. Distinguished representatives, I thank the briefers for their extensive information on the humanitarian situation on the ground and commend the work of their teams in Locus and elsewhere. They honor once again the work of this organization and everything it stands for. Following instructions of President Lula, I come back before you again today with a profound sense of urgency and dismay. We must always bear in mind the human faces on both sides of the conflict. Therefore, I extend Brazil's deepest condolences to the families and friends of all civilians, including the brave and dedicated United Nations personnel who have lost their lives in the ongoing crisis stemming from the protracted conflict in Israel and Palestine, tragically reignited by the terrorist actions by Hamas against Israel on October 7th. Nothing justifies such crimes. All hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released, and access to them by the Red Cross must be immediately granted. At the same time, the current situation in Gaza is deeply appalling and indefensible by any humane standard and under international humanitarian law. An alarming humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding before our eyes, with thousands of civilians, including an overwhelming intolerable number of children, being punished by crimes they have not committed. In 3 weeks, we have watched this conflict claim the lives of more than 8,000 civilians, of whom more than 3,000 are children. Since the last time I spoke in this council, just last week, the count of children deaths increased by 1,000. Meanwhile, the Security Council holds meetings and hears speeches without being able to take a fundamental decision to end the human suffering on the ground. As thousands in Israel and Palestine mourn their loved ones, as Israelis agonize over the fate of hostages, as Gazans suffer under relentless military operations that are killing civilians, including an intolerable number of children, we have the means to get something done, and yet we repeatedly and shamefully fail. Since October 7th, we have met several times and considered 4 draft resolutions. However, we remain at impasse due to internal disagreements particularly among some permanent members, and thanks to the persistent use of the Council to achieve self-oriented purpose instead of putting the protection of civilians above all. The grave and unprecedented human crisis before us require that sterile rivalries be relinquished, that the Council is not able to discharge its responsibility of safeguarding international peace and security due to old antagonism is morally unacceptable. Let us not fool ourselves. The eyes of the world are staring at us and will not move away from our distressing inability to act. They all see that our incapacity to unite in response to the human crisis facing us today questions the very raison d'etre of this Council. Someone has even written that in addition to civilians, this body lies beneath the rubble in Gaza. The difference is that we are our own saviors. We just need to do what is right, to spare innocent lives from the scourge of wars. There may still be time to rescue the Council and sustain the hope that many of us still have in our capacity to be true to our mandate under the Charter. It is possible only if it's enough political will, if there is enough political will to compromise and to be minimally balanced and inclusive in our diagnosis and way forward. Failure to do so, yet another failure, will add an increasingly higher cost in human lives above all, but also to multilateralism in general, to the United States and to this Council in particular. Last week, hope for consensus seemed to emerge, echoing the Secretary General's call for a humanitarian ceasefire as the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly passed a resolution that called for humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. A light at the end of the tunnel seemed to appear also when the Secretary General, who had personally been in the region to assess the situation on the ground, announced the opening of the Rafah border crossing for some initial aid deliveries, and some hostages were released. The United Nations, through its Secretariat, under the leadership of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, UNRWA, and other bodies and agencies, has been working tirelessly to address the human crisis facing us. It rests on the Security Council the responsibility to follow through. The price of inaction is unacceptably high. The growing urgency for the families of the hostages and the unbearable pain for the civilian population in Gaza cannot be understated. The positive first step taken by the UN bodies and agencies do not go far enough, as the escalation of the conflict makes the situation more dire by the hour. The relevance of a resolution of the Security Council lies on the need for sustained humanitarian aid and for granting safe working conditions for those involved in rescuing hostages and providing humanitarian work. The cessation of hostilities is therefore to the benefit of the civilian population on both sides. All the risk of reinstating the obvious, I want to put it bluntly, hostages and humanitarian aid under shells. This is why Brazil and fellow E10 members have been working tirelessly to try to get this council to act more decisively since the last showdown around proposed resolutions. In Brazil's view, the main goals are clear: the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and the end of violence through whatever modalities can be agreed without further delay, so that rapid, safe, unhindered, and sufficient humanitarian aid can be delivered to the strained people of Gaza. Besides the 8,000 lives lost, many more are about to meet their fatal destiny, as hospitals have no means to keep providing basic treatment for the patients. Therefore, providing essential resources to those in Gaza, including water, food, medical supply, fuel, and electricity, is urgent and imperative. Surgeries are being performed without anesthesia. Lives are being lost at hospitals for lack of energy and the most basic medical supplies. Food and water are scarce, and prices have skyrocketed. And the flow of humanitarian aid so far amounts to little more than a photo op. Tanks and troops are on the ground in Gaza, and time for action is running out. My questions to you all are, if not now, when? How many more lives will be lost until we finally move from rhetoric to action? It is also critical and urgent to allow for the safe and immediate evacuation of foreign nationals from Gaza and from elsewhere in the region if they feel threatened. While every state has the right and duty to protect its citizens, actions must be consistent with international law and international humanitarian law, in particular, the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, military necessity, and humanity. The right and duty to protect a state's population cannot and should not come at the cost of more deaths of civilians and more destruction of civilian infrastructure. As the UN Secretary General Guterres has repeatedly reminded us, even wars have rules. Any indiscriminative attack against civilians and critical infrastructure, as well as depriving civilians of basic goods and service, are morally injustifiable and illegal under international humanitarian law. Brazil strongly condemns actions that blur the line between civilians and combatants. Today, UNRWA shed light on the grim and disheartening reality in Gaza, highlighting the objectionable level of destruction of civilian infrastructure and tragic loss of innocent lives, including those of women, children, at least 35 of its staff. The World Health Organization has been constantly recalling the urgent need for the cessation of violence and for the humanitarian action at a time when Gaza's health infrastructure is on the verge of collapse. Beyond the immediate and very urgent humanitarian considerations, a threat to regional stability looms, and any repercussion could be catastrophic. Brazil urges a united shift towards de-escalation and calls on all parties to act with the utmost restraint. A cessation of hostilities is urgently needed to create the conditions for a full, durable, and respected ceasefire and the resumption of a credible peace process. All this is at stake as we keep our efforts to get this council to act with a unified voice. Distinguished members of the council, international humanitarian law provides a clear path to avoid greatly alleviate civilian suffering. The framework for collective action is clear. Our collective response to this crisis, which we all fear will only worsen if nothing is done, will be a defining moment for the United Nations. The staggering fact is that the Security Council does not have a reasonable record when it comes to maintaining international peace and security in the Middle East. Issues related to the region, in general, received 35 of the 250 vetoes of the permanent members. Since 2016, the Council has not been able to pass a single resolution on the situation in Palestine. The situation in the Middle East is therefore by far one of the most blocked issues in the Security Council. This speaks of ineffectiveness of the governance system and of the lack of representation of certain parts of the world in this body. A decision on the humanitarian aspects of the current crisis will certainly not redress the historic failure of the Security Council regarding the situation in the Middle East. It will, however, stop further human suffering now. Thank you. Sorry. I would like for the register to read again another sentence that that was misspelled in my speech. The sentence is on page 4. Failure to do so, yet another failure, will add an increasingly higher cost in human lives above all, but also to multilateralism in general and to the United Nations and this council in particular. I thank you. I resume now my function as president of the council. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, thank you for your presence here with us in New York today and for the special dedication that Brazil has given to peace in our region. I also pay special tribute to our briefers today and to their team's dedicated work in the most unimaginable circumstances on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Commissioner General Lazzarini, I was very shaken by your recent words to your staff over the weekend in which you said, "I am constantly hoping that this hell on earth will soon come to an end." I want to extend the UAE's deep condolences for the 64 UNRWA workers killed in this war. They paid the ultimate sacrifice for the life-saving work the United Nations does every day around the world, and we have failed to protect them. Last Friday, 121 countries, representing an overwhelming majority of the world, issued an unambiguous call for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce in Gaza. They stood up for the humanitarian imperative, for human rights, for international law, and most importantly, for the self-evident truth that Palestinian life is precious, equal, and deserving of the full protection of the law. We have heard many say that the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza are not Hamas, that this is not a war against them. And while these are welcome words, it is time that action reflected them. The more than 8,000 people that have been killed in Gaza, and as we've heard today, 70% of whom were women and children, were surely not all Hamas. Nearly 1,000 children are missing and may be trapped or dead under the rubble. They are not Hamas. Will we help them? The number of Palestinian children killed in just 3 weeks of Israel's bombardment of Gaza exceeds the total number of children killed in conflicts worldwide in each of the last 4 years. As Ms. Russell has so eloquently said, that should stain our moral conscience if nothing else does. Children do deserve our special protection and are entitled to it today. If we lean on the General Assembly's moral authority in other settings, we must also respect it in this one. Indeed, members of this council have repeatedly expressed their concerns about the fraying of the international order. This council, ignoring the expressed will of the majority of the world, may be what breaks it. Colleagues, we need a ceasefire now. As Foreign Minister Vieira said, we need to ensure that safe, sustained, and at-scale humanitarian aid reaches Gaza now, and that access to electricity, clean water, and fuel is restored now. The shutdown of cellular and internet services over the weekend as part of the offensive meant that wounded civilians were searching for help in the dark. As we have heard today, there have been over 76 attacks on healthcare, including 20 hospitals and clinics damaged or destroyed. More than 650,000 people are sheltering in UNRWA facilities. Let me be absolutely clear on this point. These sites are protected by international humanitarian law. Announcements that they are targets or warnings for them to evacuate do not, I repeat, do not
alter their protected status. We need to see the rescission of dangerous, unrealistic evacuation orders. On Saturday, the Palestinian Red Crescent reported warnings from Israel to immediately evacuate Al-Quds Hospital, which hosts hundreds of patients, including newborn babies in incubators. Around 12,000 civilians are also seeking refuge there right now as we sit here in this chamber in New York, speaking to each other again and again and debating the language of our humanitarian resolution and response. An evacuation order in these conditions is cruel, it is reckless, and so is our delay as a Security Council. Mr. President, all of Gaza's civilian population is at risk by the escalating hostilities, as are the Israeli and international hostages taken by Hamas, wrongly taken by Hamas. While our eyes have been trained on Gaza, the occupied West Bank has not been spared from violence either. Israeli settlers are escalating their attacks against Palestinian civilians and forcing their displacement. These attacks must be prevented by the State of Israel. Across the region, there have been several credible warnings of a wider escalation. The drums of war are beating. Colleagues, taking these warnings seriously begins with stopping this war in Gaza. We do not serve Israel's security by enabling it to go on. We cannot reverse the heinous October 7th attacks by condoning this war in which civilians are paying the price. Ignoring what could happen day after day will have devastating consequences, not only for Israelis and Palestinians, but for the prospects of peace and stability in our region. Mr. President, as we work on responding to the General Assembly's clear call on this body to live up to its responsibilities under the UN Charter, we should also keep in mind always the dying words of the dead so that their memories are a blessing to us. I'd like to speak today of an Arab poet, Heba Abu Neda, a Palestinian woman killed in Khan Yunis several days ago. My friend's circle diminishes, turning into little coffins scattered everywhere. As missiles launch, I can't grasp the fleeting moments with my friends. These aren't just names, they are reflections of us with a unique face and identity. Colleagues, we may have failed the dead, but we must channel our sorrow into saving the living. The time to reverse course is running out. What we and 121 countries are advocating for may be the harder road, but history warns us of the consequences of not taking it. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of China.
谢谢主席。
Thank you, Mr.
主
President.
席先生，
Mr.
我首
President,
先感谢巴
first
西
of all, I
根
would
据
like
阿
to
联酋
thank
和
Brazil
中国的
for
要求
organizing today's
举
meeting
行
upon the
今天
request
的
of
会议。
UAE and China.
我也感谢拉扎里尼主任专
I
员
thank
罗素
Commissioner
执行主
General
任
Lazzarini,
和
Executive
道
Director
顿女
Russell,
士
and Ms.
刚才
Dalton
所做的通报。
for their briefings.
你们的通报
Your
再次
briefings
反映出加沙
underscored
局
once
势的
again
严
the
峻性
gravity of the situation
和
in
阿里会
Gaza
采取行
and
动
the
的
urgency
紧
for the
迫性。
Council to act.
上周五，
Last Friday,
第10届紧急特
the
别联
10th
大
emergency
以压
special
倒
session
性
of
多
the
数
General
通过
Assembly
决议，
adopted by an overwhelming
呼
majority
吁立
a
即实
resolution
现
calling
持
for an
久的人
immediate
道休
and
战，
durable
促
humanitarian
成
pause,
停止敌
leading
对
to a
行动。
cessation of
这
hostilities.
反映了国际
This
社会的
reflected the
普遍会
widespread
者。
call on the part of the
但
international
令人遗憾
community.
和无法接受的是，
Regrettably and
以色列
unacceptably,
对国
however,
际社会的共
Israel,
同关切
turning a
置
deaf
若罔
ear to
闻，
the common concerns
进
of
一
the
步升
international
级对
community,
加
has
沙
chosen to
军事
further
行动，
escalate its military
并正
operations
式
in
宣布
Gaza and
发
formally
起地面
declared the
进攻。
launch of a ground assault.
古特雷斯秘书长警
Secretary
告，
General Guterres has warned
加沙民
that
众
the
正面
population
临
in
雪
Gaza
崩式的
is facing
灾
a
难。
disaster of an avalanche proportion.
加沙是全世界
Having
人口
one of
密
the
度
highest
最高的地
population
方之
density
一，
in the world,
是一片
Gaza
被封
is a
锁长
land
达
that has
16
been
年
under
的
blockade
土地。
for 16 long years.
这里的
The 2.3 million
230万无
innocent
辜平
people
民
are
在
living
狂风
in
乱
utter
炸中
fear amidst the indiscriminate
饥荒度
bombardment
日，水电、
and
食品、
have been cut off
燃料
from
供应
water,
已被切断
electricity,
长达
food, and
21
fuel
天。
for 21 days.
过去的周末
Just
还
this
经历
past
了近
weekend,
36
they
个小时
experienced a
的通讯
communication
中断。
blackout that lasted for nearly
如任
36
其发
hours.
展，
If
形势将
left
进一步失控。
unchecked, the
更大的
situation will
人
spiral
道主义
further out
灾
of
难
control, and
将
even
不可
greater
避免。
humanitarian catastrophe will be inevitable.
我们对正在生
We
死边
express
缘
our
挣扎
deep
的加沙
sympathy
民
to the
众
people
表
in
示
Gaza
深切
who are
同情，
struggling on the brink of life
也
and
对
death.
处在悬崖
And we
边上
are
的中
equally,
东和
if
平
not
进
more,
程
deeply
深感
worried
忧虑。
about the Middle East peace prospect
中方郑
process,
重
which is
呼
on
吁
the brink of
冲突
collapse.
方停止
China
一切
solemnly
敌对
calls
行
on the
动，
parties to the conflict to
立
cease
即
all
脱离接触，
hostilities, disengage
实现
immediately,
人道
set
休
in
战，
place a humanitarian
全力
truce,
防止
and
局
make
势
every effort
进
to
一步
prevent
升
the
级。
situation from escalating further.
中方郑重呼吁
China
以色列
solemnly
作为
calls
占
on
领方，
Israel as the
履
occupying
行
power
国际人
to
道法义
fulfill
务，
its obligations under the
解
international
除对加
humanitarian
沙的
law,
全面
lift
封
its
锁，
siege over Gaza,
立即撤销
immediately
紧急疏
rescind
散令，
its evacuation order,
尽快恢复
and
基本生存物资供
expeditiously
应，
restore the
防
supply
止
of
更
basic
大规模
necessities
人
so
道
as to
灾难。
prevent an even larger humanitarian
中
disaster.
方郑重呼吁加
China
大外交努
solemnly
力，
calls for
推
intensified
动被
diplomatic
扣押
efforts
人员
to
尽快
facilitate the
获释，
release of the hostages
并
without
争取
delay,
由此开
and
辟
to work on this
对话
basis
空
to
间，
seek to open up space
让
for
危机
dialogue
重回
so
政
as to
治解决
return
轨
to
道。
the track of a political settlement.
中方郑重呼
China
吁
solemnly calls
对
on
当事
all
方
parties.
有独特影响的大国，
China solemnly calls on
摒
the
弃
power
自身
that has
私
a
利
special
和地
power
缘
on the
政
parties
治考量，
concerned to put aside their own
为制
self-interests
止战争、
and
恢
geopolitical
复和平做出一切努
considerations
力。
and make every effort to stop the war and
主席
restore
先生，
peace. Mr.
巴以问
President,
题几十年
the
的历史已
decades-long
经告诉
history
我
of the
们，
Palestinian-Israel
军事手段
issue
不
has
是出
taught
路，
us that the military
对
means
平民
are
实
not
施
the
集体
solution.
惩罚，
Absolute
换不来绝
security
对安
cannot
全。
be achieved by
以
imposing
暴易
collective
暴只
punishment on
会加
civilians,
剧仇
and
恨和对
responding
立。
to violence with violence
我们
will
呼
only
吁冲
exacerbate
突当
hatred
事
and
方摒弃
confrontation.
对武力
We
的
call
迷
on the
信，
parties to the conflict to
致力
abandon
于
their
打
blind
破
faith
暴
in the
力
use
循
of
环，
force and
实
commit
现共
themselves
同
to
安全。
breaking the cycle of violence and achieving common security.
加沙没有防火
There is
墙，
no
在
firewall
加
in
沙打
Gaza.
一场可
It is
控
a
战
dangerous
争的
myth
迷
to
思
think that
是
a
危险
contained
的。
war is possible there.
放任加沙战
Allowing the
事
fighting
延
in
续
Gaza
下
to
去，
continue
很
could
可能
very well
演
turn
变
it
为
into
吞
a
噬整个
military
地区的
catastrophe
军事浩
that will
劫。
engulf the entire region.
约旦河西岸
The situation
离
in the
以
West
边
Bank
境
and
直
along
视
the
已经拉
Lebanese-Israeli
响警
border
报。
has already sounded the
我们
alarm.
呼吁
We call
所
on all
有
parties
担忧
concerned
冲突
about
外
the
溢的
spillover
各
of
方
the conflict
都把努力
to
放到
devote
推
their
动
efforts
加沙停
towards
火上来。
promoting a ceasefire in Gaza.
只要战争
As
仍
long as
在
the
继
war
续，
rages,
就还
more
会出现
violations of
更多违
international
反国际
humanitarian
人道
law
法
are
的
bound
情
to
况。
happen.
如果没有全
Without
面
a
停火，
comprehensive
再
ceasefire,
多的人道援助
humanitarian assistance,
都
and
是
no matter
杯
how
水
much
车
there
薪。
is, will only be a drop in
加
the
沙民
ocean.
众需要的
What the people of Gaza
不只
need
是安理
now
会
is
重
more
申
than
国际
just
人
a
道法的重要
reiteration
性，
by the Council of the importance of
重
the
复无
international
法兑现
humanitarian
的
law
保护承
and
诺，
the reputation of
而是恢
unfulfilled
复和平、
promises of protection.
维护法
What they
治、
need is
拯
concrete
救生
actions
命的
to
切实
restore
行
peace,
动。
uphold the rule of law, and
安理
save
会已
lives.
经就巴以局势
The Council
进
has
行
so far
了
held
几
several
次讨
meetings
论，
on the situation of
不
Palestine
能
and
说
Israel,
完全没
and
有
it
共
cannot
识。
be said that there was no
刚刚
consensus
通
at
过
all.
的联大
The
决议
resolution just
也为
adopted
安理
by the
会
General
指明了
Assembly
正确方
has
向。
also pointed the Council in the
面
right
对当前
direction.
十分
In the
危机
face
的
of
局
the
势，
current critical
中方
situation,
再次
China
郑
once
重
again
呼吁安理
solemnly
会
calls on the
加强
Council
团
to
结、
strengthen unity,
凝聚共识，
build consensus,
尽快
and take
采取负责任、
responsible and
有意义
meaningful
的行
action
动。
as soon as
我
possible.
们相信，
We
只
believe
要聚
that
焦
so
停
long
火
as we
止战，
focus on the most
保护
pressing
平
issues
民，
on hand, such
避
as a
免
ceasefire
更
and
大
an
人
end to
道
the
灾
fighting,
难
the
这
protection
些
of
最紧
civilians,
迫问
and the
题，
prevention of a
安理会
larger
成员
humanitarian
应该
disaster, it
也
is
能
possible
够达成
for
共识。
the members of this
此
council
时
to
此
reach
刻
a，consensus,
沉
and
默
indeed,
意
this
味
is
着
what
默
we
许，
should do. At this juncture,
不
silence
作
means
为
acquiesce, and
无异于
inaction
开
is
绿灯。
tantamount to a
全
green
世界
light.
的目光
The eyes of
正
the
望
world
向
are
这里，
upon
历
us,
史
and
将
history
记录我们
will
的选
record
择。
our
谢谢
choice.
主席。
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude Gratitude to you and your teams for the courageous work done by you under the most difficult circumstances. Humanitarian actors have stepped up, as they always do, to try and save lives in the midst of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. This work is heroic, but tragically, it comes with great risk. We mourn the more than 60 UN staff who've been killed in Gaza since the start of this conflict. The lives of UN personnel must be protected. The lives of humanitarian workers must be protected. The lives of journalists must be protected. The lives of all civilians, innocent civilians, Israeli and Palestinians, men and women, children and elderly, must be protected. There's no hierarchy when it comes to protecting civilian lives. A civilian is a civilian is a civilian. Colleagues, it's been 3 weeks since Hamas killed more than 1,400 innocent civilians and took more than 200 people hostage. Gaza-based militants continue to fire barrages of rockets toward Israel. Citizens from dozens of member states are still being held hostage by Hamas. And the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is growing more dire by the day. At this moment of pain and sorrow and suffering, we must all come together. We must all come together to call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, address the immense humanitarian needs of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, affirm Israel's right to defend itself from terrorism, and remind all actors that international humanitarian law must be respected. That means Hamas must not use Palestinians as human shields, an act of unthinkable cruelty and a violation of the law of war. And that means Israel must take all possible precautions to avoid harm to civilians. Yesterday, President Biden spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu and reiterated that while Israel has the right and responsibility to defend its citizens from terrorism, it must do so in a manner consistent with international humanitarian law. The fact that Hamas operates within and under the cover of civilian areas creates an added burden for Israel, but it does not lessen its responsibility to distinguish between terrorists and innocent civilians. Colleagues, the United States is also deeply concerned by the significant uptick in violence against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. We condemn the killings of Palestinian civilians, and we urge Israel to prevent these attacks, working with the Palestinian Authority. The Biden administration also shares the international community's concern about telecommunications shutdowns in Gaza. We've made this clear to Israeli leaders, and we understand communication networks have started to be restored. This is essential. A shutdown of telecommunication imperils the lives of civilians, UN personnel, and humanitarian workers, and risks exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Lives hang in the balance, and we must all step up, as the United States has done. We are the single largest donor to the Palestinian people, having contributed more than $1 billion to UNRWA since 2021. And President Biden recently announced an additional $100 million in humanitarian assistance for the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. But of course, no amount of aid will matter if it cannot reach people in need. And the United States continues to work with Israel, Egypt, the UN, and other partners to facilitate rapid and sustained assistance flow. Food, fuel, water, medicine, and other essential services must be restored. And while the number of trucks entering Gaza continues to increase, it is not nearly enough. The amount of humanitarian assistance flowing into Gaza must be scaled up urgently. We must do everything possible to save lives. And President Biden has expressed his support for humanitarian pauses in the fighting to allow hostages to get out, to allow humanitarian aid to reach Gaza and be distributed, and to allow safe passage for civilians, which will help people access humanitarian assistance or move to safer locations. We also continue to urge all member states to work to prevent any spillover of the crisis. Last week, Secretary Blinken asked this council to send a firm, united message to any state or non-state actor that is considering opening up another front against Israel or who may target Israel's partners, including the United States. Don't. This is a matter of international peace and security, and this council must speak out. That is one of the many reasons that last week, the United States put forward a strong and balanced Security Council resolution, one that we consulted with all member states on, and we worked to forge consensus around. This resolution received the support of the majority of this council, but Russia and China blocked its adoption. Following this veto, action moved to the General Assembly, where member states were asked to vote for a resolution that was grossly one-sided and was missing two key words, Hamas and hostage. These are deliberate omissions that give cover and empower Hamas's brutality. During the emergency special session, we also heard a few member states implicitly endorse Hamas's acts of violence, and I was frankly shocked and appalled. It is outrageous and it must be called out. It is unconscionable that Hamas's actions are not condemned by the General Assembly. Colleagues, as I've said before, the United States will continue to engage with any council member, with any member state that is committed to adopting a strong and balanced resolution. But any council product must support direct diplomacy efforts that can save lives and advance the prospects of a more peaceful and secure future for the region. Even at this difficult moment, we must keep hope alive. We must work toward a brighter future, a future where Israelis and Palestinians have equal measures of security, freedom, justice, opportunity, and dignity, a future where Palestinians realize their legitimate right to self-determination and a state of their own, a future where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace. This is not the future Hamas wants to see, but it is the future that we must all work to advance together. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Ecuador.
Señor presidente,
Mr.
para
President,
empezar
to
deseo
begin,
agradecer
I wish
al señor
to
Philip
thank Mr.
Lazzarini
Philippe Lazzarini
y a las señoras Lisa
and Ms. Lisa
Duente y
Dutton
Catherine
and
Russell
Catherine Russell
por sus
for
sombríos
their
informes esta tarde
grave
y
briefings
por
this
todo el
afternoon.
trabajo de
I wish to
UNRWA,
thank them
OCHA
for all
y
of the work
UNICEF
of UNRWA, OCHA,
en
and
tan
UNICEF
difíciles
in such
circunstancias
grueling
como las que
circumstances,
atraviesan
such
dichas
as those
entidades en
being
el territorio.
endured by these
Los
bodies on the
acontecimientos
ground.
ocurridos
The
en Gaza
events in
son muy
Gaza are
preocupantes,
of
señor
grave
presidente.
concern, Mr. President.
La situación
The
de la población
situation of
civil
the
es
civilian
desesperada.
population is
La ayuda que
desperate.
llega es
The aid that is
insuficiente y el
arriving is
futuro incierto y
insufficient. The
amenazante.
future is uncertain and
Los
menacing.
cortes de telecomunicaciones
Telecommunication
acaban de
blackouts
ser mencionados y
that
el
have just
inicio
been
de
referred
acciones
to
bélicas
and the
terrestres
beginning of
agravan
ground
este escenario.
operations are
El
worsening
Ecuador
the state
valora
of
los
affairs.
esfuerzos que se han
Ecuador values the
realizado
efforts that have
para
been made
viabilizar el
to
ingreso de
render viable
suministros
the entry
vitales
of vital
desde
supplies
Egipto
from
y
Egypt.
hace votos
We hope
para que se logre
that we
establecer
will
un sistema que
ultimately
permita
manage to
abastecer
establish a system which
a la
makes it
población
possible
civil
to
de forma
supply the civilian
suficiente y
population
constante.
in a sufficient and
Reconocemos el
continuous
derecho
fashion. We
de los
recognize the
países de
right of
proteger a
countries
su
to
población
protect their
cuando el derecho
civilians
internacional así se lo permita,
when international
al
law
tiempo que
allows.
recordamos la
However, at the same
obligación
time,
de
we
ejercer
recall the
ese derecho
obligation for that
respetando en
right
todo
to be
momento el derecho
exercised in
internacional
full
y
compliance
el
at
derecho
all times
internacional
with
humanitario,
international law and
como lo hemos
international
referido
humanitarian
en
law,
varias
as we
ocasiones
have stated on
nosotros y otros
several
miembros de este
occasions.
Consejo.
as Ecuador
El
and
Ecuador
other members
reitera
of the
su
Council
apoyo a la
indeed
labor del
have stated
secretario
on
general,
several occasions. We
al
support the
sistema de las
work
Naciones
of the
Unidas,
Secretary General,
así como
that
al
of the United
trabajo de sus
Nations
agencias
system, and we
que
support the
tienen el
work of its
mandato de
agencies
brindar
who
ayuda
have the
humanitaria a la
mandate to
población
provide humanitarian aid
afectada en este
to the
conflicto.
population affected
Mi
by this
país ha
conflict.
llamado
My country has
insistentemente a
appealed
evitar la
vehemently for
propagación de
the
la
avoidance
violencia
of
a
the
otras
spillover
zonas de
of
la
this
región.
violence to other areas in the
En esta
region.
ocasión
At this
hago especial
moment, I
mención
wish to
a la
draw particular
necesidad de
attention
evitar
to the need to
exacerbar las
avoid
tensiones y
exacerbating
alimentar la
tensions
violencia
and
en
fueling the
Cisjordania
violence in the
y en la
West Bank
frontera
and
entre
on the
Líbano e
border
Israel.
between Lebanon
Y
and Israel.
reitero
I
el pedido de
reiterate
actuar con
our request
responsabilidad
to
y
all
sentido
to
común.
act with a
De
sense
lo
of
contrario,
responsibility
solo
and
habrá más
common
muertes,
sense.
más
Anything
dolor
else
y
and
más sufrimiento.
death, more pain and more
Señor
suffering will be
presidente,
all that
como he
await.
dicho
Mr. President,
repetidamente en
as
las
I have
últimas
said on
semanas, es
several
necesario
occasions
que
in
este
recent
Consejo
weeks, this
exprese su
Council
voz
must speak
ante la
out
explosión de la
before
violencia en
the
la zona y
in the
sus
face
gravísimas
of the eruption of
consecuencias
violence
humanitarias.
in the area and
Es
its dire
indispensable agotar
humanitarian
todos los
consequences.
esfuerzos
All
para
efforts
lograrlo,
must be made
sobre todo
to
procurando
achieve
alcanzar
this goal.
acuerdos entre quienes
Particularly,
tienen
we
el poder
must
de impedir por su
reach
sola
agreements
voluntad que
between
se
those
adopte
who
una
have the
decisión
power to
mayoritaria del
prevent with their
Consejo.
will alone
Es
the adoption
oportuno
of a
recordar
decision which
que
enjoys
ejercer
the
un
majority
poder
support of this
mayor
Council. It is
también
timely
conlleva una
to
mayor responsabilidad.
recall here that
El
exercising
Consejo debe
greater
tener
power brings with
presente
it greater
que esta
responsibility. The
organización
Council
nació
must bear in
para
mind that this
defender la dignidad
organization
y
was
el valor
born
de las
to
personas
defend the
humanas,
dignity and worth of
para
the
que
human
impere
person,
la razón en
to
las
ensure that
relaciones
reason
internacionales,
prevailed in
para
international
procurar un mundo
relations,
mejor
and
para
to
todos.
create a better
Es
world
nuestra
for all.
obligación,
It is
señor
our
presidente,
obligation, Mr.
esforzarnos
President,
para
to
estar
strive
siempre a la
so that
altura
we
de esa
can
misión.
always discharge
Muchas
that
gracias.
mandate. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Ecuador, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et
Thank
je
you,
tiens à
Mr.
vous
President,
remercier
and I would like to
de
thank
présider pour
you
une seconde fois une
for
réunion
for
d'urgence
the
du
second
Conseil
time
de sécurité sur la
chairing
situation
an
au
emergency
Moyen-Orient
meeting of
ce
the
mois.
Security Council on the situation in the Middle
Je
East
tiens
this
aussi
month.
à remercier
I
le
would also
commissaire
like to
général de
thank
l'UNRWA,
the
Philippe
Commissioner General
Lazzarini,
of
la
UNRWA,
directrice
Philippe
Lisa
Lazzarini,
Doughton d'OCHA
Director Lisa
et la
Doughton of
directrice
OCHA,
exécutive
and
Catherine
the
Russell de
Executive
l'UNICEF
Director of UNICEF,
pour leur
Catherine Russell,
présentation et
for their
surtout,
briefings and their
tous leurs
efforts,
efforts dans
and
ces
above
circonstances
all of their
particulièrement
efforts
tragiques.
in these particularly tragic
Nous
circumstances.
présentons nos très sincères
We offer
condoléances
our
à
very
l'ONU,
sincere
en
condolences
particulier
to
à
the UN,
l'UNRWA,
in
pour
particular
les dizaines de
to UNRWA,
collaborateurs et
for the
collaboratrices
dozens of
morts dans
personnel
l'exercice de
who
leurs
died
fonctions.
in the course of their duties.
Nos condoléances vont
Our
également aux
condolences
proches des
also
milliers
go
de
to
civils
the
israéliens et
relatives of the
palestiniens,
thousands of
dont plus
Israeli
d'un
and
tiers
Palestinian
d'enfants
civilians,
qui ont
more
si
than a third of
tragiquement et
them
tristement
children,
perdu la vie
who
ces
have
dernières
lost their
semaines.
lives, tragically lost their lives in
Depuis le
recent
7
weeks.
octobre, la Suisse a fermement
Since the 7th
condamné
of October,
les actes de
Switzerland has strongly
terreur,
condemned
les
the
tirs
acts of terror,
indiscriminés de roquettes
indiscriminate
contre la
rocket fire
population
against the
israélienne
Israeli
et la
population,
prise d'otages
and
menée par le
hostage
Hamas.
taking perpetrated by
Dans ce
Hamas.
contexte,
In
la
this
Suisse a exprimé
context,
sa
Switzerland
solidarité
expressed its
envers la
solidarity with
population
the
israélienne.
Israeli people.
Tous les otages retenus à
All
Gaza doivent
hostages
être
held in
libérés
Gaza must be released
immédiatement et
immediately and
inconditionnellement.
unconditionally.
Nous avons reconnu
We have
la volonté
recognized
légitime de défense et de
Israel's
sécurité nationale
legitimate concern
d'Israël,
for national defense
rappelant
and
que
security,
sécurité
recalling
légitime
that
et
the
nécessité
legitimate
militaire
needs of
sont prises en
security and
compte par
military
le droit
necessity
international
are
humanitaire
taken into
qui doit
account
être
by international
respecté
humanitarian
par
law,
toutes les
which
parties au
must be
conflit.
respected by all parties to the
Nous
conflict.
soulignons une fois encore le
We
caractère
stress once again
obligatoire
the
de toutes ces
binding nature
règles,
of all
sans
its rules,
exception,
without
en
exception,
particulier
in
les
particular
principes de
the principles
distinction,
of
de
distinction,
proportionnalité et de
proportionality,
précaution dans
and
la conduite des
precaution in the
hostilités.
conduct of hostilities.
Il est nécessaire que des enquêtes soient menées sur toutes les violations
All
du droit
violations of
international
international law
afin que
must be
leurs auteurs
investigated
puissent être
so that the
traduits en
perpetrators
justice.
can be brought to justice.
Comme elle l'a fait à maintes reprises,
As
la
it has
Suisse
done on many
réitère
occasions,
que l'application du droit
Switzerland
international
reiterates that the
humanitaire et des
application
droits
of
humains,
international
notamment
humanitarian
la
law and
protection des
human
civils,
rights, in
est
particular the
et
protection
doit
of
rester
civilians,
une priorité de
is
ce
and must
Conseil.
remain a
Il faut
priority for
donc
this Council.
impérativement
It is
protéger les
therefore
civils et les
imperative
personnes
to
qui ne
protect protect
participent
civilians
plus
and
aux
people who
hostilités.
are no longer
Il
taking
faut les
part in
protéger
hostilities.
des actes de
We
terreur
must
en
protect them
Israël.
from acts of
Il faut les
terror in
protéger à
Israel,
Gaza
and we
et
must
en
protect them in
Cisjordanie où
Gaza and the
l'augmentation
West
des
Bank,
violences,
where the increase
notamment
in
par les
violence,
colons, est inquiétante.
particularly by
Il convient
settlers is
d'exercer
worrying.
notre influence
We
sur les
must
parties au
exert our
conflit
influence on the
afin de
parties to the
respecter le droit
conflict to
international
ensure that
humanitaire,
international
de stopper la
humanitarian law
spirale de
is
violence
respected,
actuelle
to
et
halt the current
d'empêcher qu'elle ne
spiral of
gagne la
violence and
région.
prevent it from spreading throughout the
Nous
region.
l'avons entendu à Gaza,
As we
l'entière
have heard, in
population,
Gaza, the entire
composée de près de la
population,
moitié
almost
d'enfants,
half of
se
whom are
trouve aujourd'hui
children, is
entièrement
now under
assiégée.
siege
Les
entirely.
infrastructures civiles, y
Civilian
compris les écoles de
infrastructure,
l'UNRWA,
including
et en
UNRWA
particulier les
schools and
hôpitaux,
in
sont
particular
protégés par le droit
hospitals,
international
are
humanitaire.
protected by
Elles
international
doivent pouvoir
humanitarian
fournir
law.
sécurité
They
et
must be able
assistance
to
aux
provide
civils.
security and
La
assistance to
population doit
civilians.
avoir accès
The
en
population
qualité et
must have
quantité
access in
suffisante
sufficient
aux biens et
quality and
services
quantity
essentiels,
to
y
essential
compris à l'eau
goods and
potable,
services,
à la
including drinking
nourriture,
water,
aux soins
food,
médicaux et aux
medical
carburants.
care, and fuel.
La Suisse s'est très activement engagée au sein de ce
Switzerland has been
Conseil et à
working very
l'Assemblée
actively within
générale
this
pour le
council and at the
respect du droit
General
international
Assembly for
humanitaire
the
et la
respect
mise
for
en place de
international
mesures
humanitarian law
telles
and
que
the
des
introduction
pauses
of
ou trêves
measures
humanitaires
such as
pour
humanitarian
garantir
pauses
l'accès
or
de l'aide.
truces to
De
guarantee
telles
access
mesures,
to aid.
accompagnées de
Such
garanties
measures, accompanied
sécuritaires,
by
sont
security
nécessaires pour
guarantees,
permettre au
are
personnel
necessary to
d'organisations
enable
humanitaires
the
impartiales
personnel of
de
impartial
travailler de manière
humanitarian
efficace
organizations to
dans
work
le but de
effectively
répondre
to
aux besoins de la
respond
population
to the
et
needs of the
d'atténuer
population and to
l'aggravation de la
alleviate
crise
the
sanitaire à
worsening
Gaza.
sanitary
Cela
crisis
est
in
d'autant plus
Gaza.
nécessaire à la
This is
lumière
all the
d'une
more necessary
intensification
in the
des
light
hostilités
of
ces
the
derniers jours.
intensification of hostilities in
Monsieur
recent
le
days.
Président, une
Mr.
action
President,
unifiée de ce
unified action
Conseil
by this
est donc plus
Council
que jamais
is
nécessaire
therefore more
pour mettre
necessary than
fin aux
ever
violences,
to put an
faire
end to the
respecter le droit
violence, ensure
international
respect
et
for
œuvrer à la
international
paix.
law, and work
La Suisse
towards peace.
continuera à
Switzerland will
déployer tous les
continue
efforts
to
pour la
make
recherche
every
d'une
effort
telle
to seek
action
such
de ce
action by this
Conseil
Council
pour qu'il
so that
assume
it
sa
assumes its
responsabilité
responsibility
face à cette
in the
crise.
face of
Je vous
this
remercie.
crisis. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie
I
le
thank
commissaire général
UNRWA
Philippe
Commissioner
Lazzarini,
General
la
Philippe
directrice
Lazzarini,
exécutive
the Executive
Catherine
Director
Russell
Catherine Russell,
et la directrice
and
Lisa
OCHA
Docton
Director
pour leur
Lisa
exposé
Docton for their
sur la situation
briefings
à Gaza
on
ces
the
dernières heures.
current situation in Gaza.
Je suis humainement
I
bouleversé
am
par leurs différents
quite
récits
frankly
et
shocked to the core
témoignages.
by their briefings
Je
and
remercie
accounts.
les
I
Émirats arabes
wish
unis et
to
la
thank
Chine
the
pour
United Arab
l'initiative
Emirates and
de
China
cette réunion
for convening
d'urgence,
this emergency
parce que
open
nous ne
briefing
pouvons
because
pas, en tant que
we
Conseil de sécurité,
cannot, as a Security
rester
Council,
sans réaction
remain
devant
unmoved
l'ampleur insoutenable
in the face
de
of the
l'horreur sous nos yeux.
unbearable extent of the horror playing out before our
L'intensification
eyes.
des frappes
The
aériennes d'Israël, combinée
the
au
intensification of Israel's
déploiement terrestre
airstrikes
des forces à
together with
Gaza,
the ground operations of
alourdit de
forces in
façon
Gaza
dramatique
is
le
causing the
lourd bilan
huge
humain
death toll of this
de
war
la
to
terrible guerre
tragically
qui
skyrocket.
moralement nous
This
ébranle.
is a
La
heinous
paralysie
war
de ce Conseil
which
est
is morally
impensable et
unacceptable. The
inadmissible, alors
paralysis
que
of this
près
council
de
is
10 000
unacceptable and
personnes, dont un
inconceivable.
millier d'enfants
10,000 people,
sont
including
tués
1,000 children,
depuis
have
les
been
attaques
killed
barbares
since
du
the
Hamas en
heinous attacks
Israël
of Hamas
le
in
7
Israel on
octobre
the 7th
dernier.
of October.
Il est plus que temps
It is high
que
time
ce bain de sang
for this
cesse.
bloodbath to cease.
Le Gabon réitère
Gabon,
sa ferme
once again,
condamnation de
staunchly
toute violence
condemns
meurtrière
all
indiscriminée.
deadly, indiscriminate
Nous voulons le
violence.
dire de
We
façon
wish
très
to say the
claire.
following very clearly
Les
indeed.
populations
Civilian
civiles
populations
ne doivent
must
être
be
ni une
neither
monnaie d'échange,
currency
ni des boucliers
nor
humains,
human shields,
ni
nor
l'objet
must
de
they be the
punitions
target
collectives.
of collective punishment.
Tous les otages
All
doivent être
hostages
libérés sans
must be
condition.
released
Et le
unconditionally,
droit à la
and
légitime défense d'Israël
Israel's right to
doit
self-defense
s'exercer
must be
dans le respect
exercised
du droit
in
international
accordance
humanitaire
with international
et des principes de
humanitarian law
proportionnalité,
and with the
de
principles of
précaution et de
proportionality,
distinction.
precaution, and distinction.
Le cycle
The cycle
déshumanisant
of the
de violence
dehumanizing cycle of
contre les
violence
populations
against
civiles
civilian
doit
populations
immédiatement
must
cesser.
immediately
Au
stop.
sein de ce Conseil,
Within this
nous
council,
devons
we must
transcender
move
les
beyond
liens d'inaction politique et
the
géopolitique
bonds
ainsi que les
of the
clivages et
political
rivalités
and
stériles
geopolitical
pour
bonds that bind
exiger
us to
l'arrêt
inaction. We
immédiat
must move
des
beyond
hostilités
divisions,
et un accès sans
rivalry,
entrave
and
de l'aide
sterility to
humanitaire
call for an
aux
immediate
populations
cessation of
dans le besoin
hostilities and for
qui se trouvent
unhindered
piégées dans les
humanitarian
ruines dévastées
access
de Gaza.
to those in
Le
need,
Gabon
those
appelle au
civilians
respect
trapped in
et
the
à la mise
devastated
en œuvre
ruins
de la
of Gaza.
résolution
We
adoptée
call
par
for the
l'Assemblée
compliance
générale
with and implementation
le
of the
26 octobre
resolution adopted
2023.
by the General Assembly on the
Et nous
26th of
saluons les
October
efforts dans
2023.
la recherche de
We
l'apaisement des
hail
pays
the
de la
efforts
région,
to restore
tout en
calm
faisant écho de l'appel du
undertaken
secrétaire
by
général
the
des Nations
countries in the
Unies
region. At the same
à un
time, we
cessez-le-feu
reiterate
humanitaire.
the Secretary
Nous
General's appeal for
réitérons
a
notre appel
humanitarian
à la retenue
ceasefire. We
et
reiterate our
encourageons
appeal
tous
for
les États
restraint and
qui
encourage
ont
all
une
states
influence
that
sur
have
les partis
influence
à
that they
redoubler
can bring to
d'efforts
bear on parties
pour les
to
amener
ratchet
à
up
choisir la
efforts
paix
to bring
et à
parties to
préserver
choose
les vies
peace
humaines.
and to preserve human
Monsieur le
life.
Président,
Mr. President,
nous sommes tous
we
conscients du
are
risque
all
que fait
aware
peser
of
le
the risk
conflit
that the
israélo-palestinien
Israel-Palestine
sur la
conflict
paix et la
poses
stabilité de
to peace
l'ensemble
and
de la
stability
région
in
et
the
au-delà.
region as a whole and
Nous devons
beyond.
éviter un
We must
embrasement
avoid a
qui soit
conflagration
un chemin
which
de
would stand
non-retour vers le
as
chaos.
a point of no return
Je voudrais
and would
terminer
lead us into
en
chaos
réaffirmant
once and
la
for all.
conviction de mon
To
pays
conclude, I wish to
que la
reaffirm my country's
diplomatie,
conviction
le
that
dialogue et
diplomacy,
la
dialogue,
négociation,
and
avec un rôle
negotiation, with
central des
a
Nations
central
Unies,
role played by
sont
the
et
United
demeurent
Nations,
les
are
canaux
and remain
incontournables pour
vital
parvenir
channels
à une
to
solution durable à
achieve
cette
a
crise
lasting
meurtrière.
solution to this deadly
Et nous
crisis.
réitérons
We
notre
reiterate
attachement
our
à la
commitment
solution
to
à deux
the
États. Je vous
two-state
remercie.
solution. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Gabon for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I thank the briefers, today's briefers, for their stark briefings, and also thank and applaud your teams for your important work on the ground. Commissioner General Lazzarini, we convey our sincere condolences for the tragic loss of UNRWA staff in these past weeks. For years, the agency has been an important stabilizing force in the region. In recent days, your work has been nothing short of heroic, and you can count on our full support. President, Malta is gravely concerned by the desperate situation in Gaza. Such military operations will undoubtedly have a devastating impact on the more than 2 million civilians trapped in the enclave. Let us not forget that these civilians were already perilously vulnerable and living in dire conditions. During these last days, thousands broke into UNRWA warehouses and distribution centers, taking wheat, flour, and other basic items. This illustrates how desperate the situation on the ground is, and is a worrying sign that civil order is starting to break down. In parallel, Hamas continues rocket barrage into Israeli territory, with some reaching Tel Aviv. This is completely unacceptable. We unequivocally reject and condemn these barbaric attacks, including the 7th October attack and the taking of hostages. These are heinous acts of terrorism. We reiterate our call on Hamas to immediately release all hostages safely and unconditionally, and urge parties with influence to continue negotiations to this end. Malta condemns all violence against civilians. All parties to the conflict are obligated to abide by international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. They must take all feasible precautions to avoid, and in any event minimize, harm to civilians and civilian objects. These including objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. We are utterly devastated to note the effects the conflict is having on Palestinian and Israeli children. Thousands have perished, while the rest are suffering unthinkable psychological traumas. We underscore that the killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools, hospitals, places of worship, and denial of children's access to humanitarian assistance are all grave violations. We also echo the concerns raised regarding the children being held by Hamas. We reiterate our call for their immediate release and for their special protection needs to be prioritized. President, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza can no longer be ignored. Urgent action is needed. This is why we voted in favor of the General Assembly resolution last Friday at the 10th Emergency Special Session. We welcome the provisions of this resolution calling for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. This is the minimum requirement to ensure protection of civilians. Meanwhile, we remain concerned that this Council has been unable to act in the face of this accelerating crisis. We echo the Secretary-General's message that this is a moment of truth. Our immediate priority must be to address the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe and to reverse current escalations. We urge Council members to unite in good faith and act decisively for the sake of regional and international security. We also stress that it is unacceptable that humanitarian actors working through the most life-threatening and extraordinary conditions to protect Gazan civilians also must contend with communications blackouts. Connectivity is of utmost importance, not only to the civilian population, but also so that aid responders can continue doing their critical work. Malta reiterates the call also made in the European Council conclusions for the continued, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access in Gaza, including through humanitarian corridors and pauses. All efforts made by international actors in this regard are welcome. Furthermore, we are alarmed at the precarious developments in areas outside of Gaza. It is critical that the international community works together to prevent a spillover which would further increase internal tensions and destabilize the entire region. Malta underscores that any lasting and sustainable plan for peace in the Middle East must be based on a two-state solution, in line with relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. De-escalation, restraint, and mediation are critical. The longer we fail to address these imperatives, the harder it will become to climb out of the abyss and towards the path of peace. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je
Mr.
remercie
President,
le commissaire général de l'UNRWA,
I thank the
la
Commissioner General
directrice
of UNRWA,
exécutive de l'UNICEF et
Executive
le
Director
bureau de
of UNICEF,
coordination
and the
des
Office
affaires
for the
humanitaires
Coordination of
pour leurs
Humanitarian
exposés.
Affairs for their briefings.
Les attaques terroristes du
The
Hamas
terrorist
et
attacks by
d'autres groupes
Hamas and
contre
other groups
Israël
against
le 7
Israel
octobre
on the 7th of
ont
October
déclenché une
have
crise
triggered
sans
an
précédent.
unprecedented crisis.
La situation humanitaire à
The
Gaza est
humanitarian
dramatique.
situation in
Des
Gaza is
civils
tragic.
meurent chaque jour,
Civilians are
dont de
dying
nombreux
every day,
enfants.
including many
La
children.
population a faim.
The population
Le manque
is going
d'eau fait
hungry.
courir le
The lack
risque
of water
d'épidémies et
brings
les
with it the
hôpitaux
risk of
sont
epidemics,
débordés.
and hospitals are
Il est
overwhelmed.
urgent de
It
garantir
is
un accès
urgent
humanitaire
that
sans entrave à la bande de Gaza
unfettered
qui a
humanitarian
besoin de
access be
vivres,
guaranteed for the
d'eau
Gaza
et
Strip that needs
d'électricité.
food, water,
Le
and
nombre de
electricity.
convois
The
doit
number of
augmenter de manière
convoys must
significative
increase
pour être à la hauteur des
significantly in
besoins.
order to be commensurate
Il
with
faut
what
une
is
trêve
needed.
humanitaire
A
pour
humanitarian
amener
truce is
à
needed,
terme
which could
à un
ultimately
cessez-le-feu.
lead to a
La France a
ceasefire.
augmenté de manière
France has
significative son aide
significantly
humanitaire
increased
à
its
travers
humanitarian
l'affrètement d'un vol
assistance through
spécial
the
le
chartering
week-end
of a
dernier.
special
Elle
flight
salue
last
l'engagement
weekend
du secrétaire
and welcomes
général,
the commitment
le
of the
travail
Secretary
des
General,
agences des
the
Nations
work
Unies et
of
celui
UN
des acteurs
agencies, and
humanitaires
the
sur le
work of
terrain
humanitarian
qui
actors on the
travaillent
ground
dans des conditions
who are
extrêmement
working in
difficiles.
extremely
Nous
difficult
adressons
conditions.
nos plus sincères
Our most
condoléances aux
sincere
Nations Unies
condolences go to
après
the
le décès de
United Nations
63
following the
personnels de
deaths of
l'UNRWA.
63 UNRWA
Les
staff
civils
members.
doivent pouvoir sortir de
Civilians must be
Gaza
able
sans
to
en
leave
être
Gaza
empêchés.
without
Nous
being
l'avons d'ailleurs demandé
impeded
avec
from doing
constance
so,
pour nos
and we
propres
have constantly
ressortissants et leurs
requested that
familles
for
depuis
our
le 7
own nationals
octobre.
and their families since the 7th
Rien
of
ne
October.
saurait
Nothing
justifier
can
les
justify
souffrances des
the
civils.
suffering of
Ils doivent
civilians
être
who must
protégés.
be protected.
Toutes les victimes
All
méritent notre
victims
compassion et toutes les vies
deserve
se valent.
our compassion,
Israël
and all
a le
lives are
droit
valuable.
de se
Israel has
défendre
the right to
et
defend
le devoir de
itself
le faire dans le
and the
respect du droit
duty to do
international
so in
humanitaire
compliance with
en
international
préservant les
humanitarian law,
populations civiles.
sparing the
La
civilian
France a
population.
voté en faveur de la
France
résolution
voted in
présentée par
favor
la
of the
Jordanie
resolution
au
introduced
nom
by
du groupe
Jordan on
arabe
behalf of the
qui
Arab
demande
group,
une trêve et un
which
accès
calls
humanitaire
for
et de
a
protéger
truce
les
and
civils,
humanitarian
qui
access and for the
condamne les
protection
actes
of civilians,
terroristes et qui
which
demande
condemns
la
terrorist
libération
acts and which calls
immédiate
for
et
the immediate
inconditionnelle
and
des
unconditional
otages.
release of
Et
hostages.
je rappelle notre
And I recall
condamnation
our
dans les termes les
condemnation
plus
in
forts
the most
des
energetic
attaques
terms
terroristes du
of
Hamas,
the
qui ne
terrorist attacks
représentent en
by
rien les
Hamas, which in
Palestiniens
no way
et qui
represents
n'a
the
que mépris
Palestinians
pour leur
and which has
souffrance.
nothing but
Je
contempt for
réitère
their
également
suffering.
notre demande que
I
les
also
otages soient
reiterate
libérés
our call for the
immédiatement
hostages
et
to be
sans
released
condition.
immediately and without
Après ce
condition.
vote à l'Assemblée
Following
générale,
this
ce
vote in the
Conseil doit
General
pouvoir
Assembly, This Council must be able to fully shoulder its responsibilities and achieve a just decision based on our common principles. France will continue to work on the new draft resolution presented by Brazil so that it can be adopted quickly. Mr. President, the extreme severity of the situation in Gaza should not lead us to forget what is happening in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. France firmly condemns the violence perpetrated by settlers against the Palestinian population, acts of violence which are increasing in the West Bank. We call on the Israeli authorities to put a stop to this. We must prevent this engulfing the entire region. France remains extremely worried following a launching of a shell that landed in UNIFIL headquarters in the south of Lebanon on the 28th of October. France is committed to avoiding a spread of this conflict. This war has reminded us, as if any reminder were necessary, that the world can no longer ignore the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and security. We all are aware of the conditions for this, namely the necessary security guarantees for Israel and a state for the Palestinians. We must all mobilize in order to restore a political horizon. The only viable solution is a two-state solution, and France will continue its engagement within this Council for it to adopt a resolution as quickly as possible. We owe this to the Israelis and the Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Ms. Dawson for the information provided. We pay tribute to you, your work and your teams on the ground, and mourn the loss of over 60 UN workers fallen in the line of duty. The past 3 weeks have been dramatic for Israelis and Palestinians and tormenting for the Middle East and many elsewhere. The overall death toll in civilian victims is frightening and unsustainable. We extend our condolences and deepest sympathy to the families of all victims, Israelis and Palestinians alike. Mr. President, 7th of October will remain a defining moment in the never-quiet history of the Middle East. Hamas, its brutality and terror, the worst in human behavior, will not and must not be forgotten. In the current utterly complex situation, there is an accumulation of competing urgencies: the response to terror and the continued rocket launches from Gaza, the liberation of hostages, the protection of civilians, the provision of humanitarian help, and the increased risk of spillover of the conflict. Let me quickly go through each of them. First, in its exercise of the right of self-defense, which we recognize and support like for every other country under attack, Israel is determined to eradicate Hamas. It should not be portrayed mistakenly as a license to punish Palestinians. It is beyond any doubt that conducting warfare in such a densely populated area as Gaza is difficult, challenging, very demanding, and it must be conducted prudently, professionally, and in compliance with international humanitarian law. We profoundly regret every innocent life lost without distinction. While circumstances may be different, a loss is always a loss. Therefore, there is need for maximum precaution not to harm those who are twice in danger. First, from Hamas and their policies on one hand, and a fight they have not chosen on the other. It is therefore extremely important and urgent to do everything possible that civilian populations are not found in that hopeless place from where there is no escape. Second, nothing can ever justify abducting and holding hostages innocent people, children, women, and elderly, even less so using them as Hamas is doing. They must be liberated, they must be brought home. We welcome efforts from various actors in this respect and urge them to continue. Third, unhindered humanitarian help at scale must be urgently provided to all those in need. We cannot contemplate children dying in the hospital because of the lack of medicine or electricity or water or lack of communications. We cannot contemplate lack of food for entire families, adding to an already difficult situation the total breakdown of law and order because of lack of basic commodities. The government of Israel has promised that soon aid will flow in abundance. It should happen immediately. Those who are spared from the fighting do not need to die from hunger. Colleagues, we try to put ourselves in Israel's shoes, feel the trauma of terror striking with a ferocity we cannot forget, faced with an existential question with countries and proxies that seek openly to destroy it. I don't think anyone here or anywhere would feel at ease knowing that your next door neighbor is just waiting for the right moment to kill you. How can this not bring back horrible memories, that fear and anxiety summarized in the Never Again Pledge? But we also put ourselves in the very same way, in the shoes of the Palestinians, feeling the unexplainable pain of civilians caught in the midst of a war that has befallen on them, a war first imposed by Hamas and the likes, decided elsewhere by their masters who are rubbing their hands in the face of casualties they had anticipated and hoped for in a turmoil of all dangers. We feel for Palestinians who for decades, at every time they neared to the horizon of their future with their state, those against would always be quicker to disrupt it and push it further away. We feel for those thousands on both sides of this terrible divide who have lost their loved ones, the families of the hostages, and all those torn apart by death and grief and the insecurity of tomorrow. Wars are sometimes unavoidable because imposed, but they are always brutal. They bring inevitable destruction. They cause victims and sadly often casualties among those who don't deserve it. But even wars have laws and they must be respected. We believe and trust that there is a way, there is and must be a way to ensure the security of Israel and its people while ensuring the security of the perspective of all Palestinians who do not want war. Colleagues, beyond the tragedy unfolding in Israel and Gaza, the magnitude of the human suffering is impacting people across borders and identities, and we notice a sharp increase in the hate and division, including the threat of terrorism and targeted violence. This sharp and often confusing polarization fails to acknowledge our common humanity, and that the killing of innocent civilians, regardless of religion or ethnic background, is wrong, unacceptable. The frightening images of the bloodthirsty mob yesterday in Dagestan hunting for Jewish people is another appalling illustration of intolerable and appalling rise of anti-Semitism. No one should stay indifferent to allow rallies where people chant "kill the Jews" or "destroy Israel." This is why there is so much need for wisdom, responsibility, and action on the ground and from this council, because otherwise confusion, hatred, tension, and violence will continue, not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but also elsewhere in the Middle East and beyond, dividing societies, fueled by strong emotions, ideologies, and beliefs, overpowering cold minds and reason, and overshadowing forward-looking perspectives. Last but not least, Mr. President, the serious risk of spillover. Hezbollah is playing with fire, and attacks from the northern border are becoming more and more threatening. If this continues, it may be a matter of time before the irreparable point is reached. It must be resisted, since it will only bring the region and all the countries involved near a catastrophe. In this respect, we're also very concerned for the situation in the West Bank. We condemn the extremist settler violence on Palestinians, which is totally unacceptable. Such acts must be fully investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. Mr. President, in the face of so much complexity and adversity, we think it is urgent to start thinking about the Gaza of tomorrow, the Gaza without Hamas, without extremists. There is need to offer Palestinian civilians in Gaza a perspective, a new organization of life under a new administration. Hamas has let them down. Hamas has brought war to them. Hamas did not bring them prosperity because it invested in tunnels and rockets, in hatred and death. We need to start thinking how the fabric of the society can be repaired so that the children know that what shalom means, instead of being raised with and repeating death to the Jews. If not, the Hamas of today will only be replaced by the Hamas of tomorrow, maybe with another name, but with the same hatred, the same ideology, the same goals, embroiled in a never-ending cycle of hurting the other, acting falsely in the name of God they disrespect, and acting falsely in the name of a future they simply oppose. This is why there is a need to revive the political process as soon as possible, because in its absence there will only be unhappiness, poverty, discrimination, hatred, tension, never-ending violence, victims, and as it has happened many times, exploitation by terrorist extremists and their supporters. And let's not fool ourselves. The next war will be only deadlier. But it is preventable if we all work together with conviction and in good faith for peace, for lasting peace. And I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Albania and for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mozambique thanks the Brazilian president for timely convening this meeting. We also thank the briefers, Mr. Felipe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of United Nations Relief and the Workers Agency for Palestine Refugees in East, Ms. Lisa Dothen, OSHA's Director of Humanitarian, Financial and Resource Mobilization Division, and Mrs. Catherine Rossell, Executive Director of United Nations Children Fund, for their insight and update on the current situation in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, a glue and tragic situation is taking place in Gaza. We are horrified by reports of suffering and death of children, women, and men in Gaza. It is clear that the protection of civilians in time of war is not being observed. In this context, Mozambique joins our voice with that of many others in reiterating an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire to ease the suffering of millions of our brothers and sisters, Israelis and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, we should remind ourselves that the laws of war have established the clear rules to protect human lives, human dignity, and respect humanitarian needs. These laws cannot augur or sidelined under any circumstances. They must be respected and observed by everyone, everywhere, at all times, without exception or excuse. We have condemned attacks on Hamas on 7 October against the Israeli children, women, and men. We strongly condemn the attacks against the civilian populations, in particular children, women, elderly, and the UN humanitarian staff. We call on their protection. That is vital. It is therefore imperative that we continue working together towards ensuring the safety and protections of civilians in the conflict zones. The world looks at us as experts, as a member of this Security Council, to respond expeditiously to the situation in the Gaza Strip. The United Nations awaits actions and leadership from this Council. Article 24 of the UN Charter clearly states that, I quote, in order to ensure prompt and effective action by United Nations, its members confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security, end of the quote. Accordingly, we reiterate our appeal to members of this Council to fulfill their functions and powers to change the course of actions in the Gaza Strip. Mozambique As a strong advocate for peace and dialogue in the Middle East region, particularly in Palestine, we echo the United Secretary General repeated calls towards resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the key to sustainable peace in the Middle East. For this desirable purpose, we firmly believe that the parties can work together through constructive dialogue for a lasting peace in full compliance with the principles of two-state solution based on Security Council and General Assembly resolutions and decisions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Mozambique, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
уважаемый господин министр,
distinguished Mr. Minister,
всецело поддерживаем
we fully
созван
support the
делегациями
convening by the delegations
ОАЭ и
of
Китая
the
срочного
UAE
заседания
and China of this
Совета
emergency meeting of
безопасности
the
по
Security
гуманитарной
Council on the
ситуации в
humanitarian
Сахаре.
situation in the Gaza Strip.
С крайней обеспокоенностью заслушали
We were
оценки
extremely
положения на
concerned to hear the
земле
assessments of the situation
от
on the
генерального
ground from the
комиссара
Commissioner
БАПО
General of
Филиппа
UNRWA,
Лазарини,
Philippe Lazzarini,
исполнительного директора ЮНИСЕФ Кэтрин
UNICEF
Рассел
Executive Director
и
Catherine
директора
Russell,
КДР Лиза
and
Дауд.
OCHA Director Lisa Doughton.
Коллеги, пришло
Colleagues,
время назвать
the
вещи
time has
своими
come
именами.
to call things by their
На
names.
оккупированной
On
палестинской
the occupied
территории
Palestinian territory, the
западном
west
берегу
bank of
реки
the
Иордан в
Jordan
секторе
River and
Газа
the Gaza Strip,
разворачивается
a
гуманитарная
humanitarian
катастрофа
catastrophe
библейского
of
масштаба.
biblical proportions is unfolding.
Поступающая информация,
According
число
to incoming
погибших в анклаве
information, the number of
перевалило за
people
8
killed in
тысяч
the
человек,
enclave has exceeded
половина из
8,000,
которых дети,
half of
женщины,
which are
пожилые.
children, women, and older
Под
persons.
завалами находится более
More
2000
than
человек,
2,000 people are buried
половина
under the
из
rubble,
которых
half of
также
which are
дети.
also children.
Более 21
More than
тысячи человек ранено.
21,000 people have been wounded.
Количество
The
внутренне
number of
перемещенных лиц
internally
в Газе
displaced persons
достигло
in Gaza has reached
1,6
1.6 million people.
Только в лагерях
In
Бапор
UNRWA
находится
camps
640 тысяч
alone, there are
палестинцев.
640,000
Назбри более сотни
Palestinians. In the
погибших.
West Bank, more than 100
3000
people have been
пострадавших.
killed and 3,000 have been injured.
Эти жуткие цифры растут
These
с каждым
chilling
часом.
numbers are growing by the hour.
Выражаем
We
благодарность
express
всем
our
гуманитарным
gratitude to all
сотрудникам на
humanitarian
земле,
workers on the
работающим на
ground that are
исходе сил
working to
в условиях
exhaustion with
катастрофической
a
нехватки
catastrophic
базовых,
lack of
в том числе
basic,
медицинских
including
товаров,
medical
а
supplies,
также с крайне
and
высокими
also
рисками для
with
жизни.
an extremely high risk to their own lives.
Масштаб потерь со
The
стороны
scale of
ООНовских
losses
агентств
from UN
шокирует.
agencies is
64
shocking.
сотрудника убиты,
63 staff
22
members have been
ранены,
killed, 22 have
42
been
объекта
injured,
ВАПОР
and
разбиты.
42 UNRWA objects have been
Мы
destroyed.
отдаем дань
And we
сотрудникам
pay
ООН,
tribute
которые
to the
продолжают
UN
работать
staff
в
that continue to
невообразимых
work
условиях,
in
и
unimaginable
тем, кто
conditions,
заплатил за
and to
это
those
своей
that
жизнью.
have paid for this with their lives.
По информации СМИ, в ходе
According to media
израильских обстрелов
reports,
на
during
голубой линии
Israeli
ранены
shelling
два
on the Blue
европейца
Line,
временной
2
силы ООН в Ливане.
peacekeepers from the UN interim
Под
force
угрозой
in Lebanon have been
атаки
wounded.
Цахал оказалась
The
крупнейшая в Газе
largest
больница
hospital in
Аль-Кудс.
Gaza, Al-Quds, is
Израильские
under threat of attack from the
военно-воздушные силы
IDF. The
наносят
Israeli
удары
Air
в
Force
50
is launching
метрах от
strikes 50
учреждений,
meters from
требуя
facilities,
немедленной эвакуации.
demanding immediate
Почти
evacuation.
640 тысяч
Almost
внутренне перемещенных
640,000
лиц нашли
IDPs
убежище в
have found
150
refuge in
объектах ВАПОР по
150
всему
UNRWA
сектору
sites
Газа.
across the Gaza
В
Strip.
результате
As a
бомбардировок
result of the
полностью
bombing,
вынесены из
9
строя 9
hospitals
больниц,
are
в оставшихся
entirely
остров
unusable, and the
дефицитных.
remaining ones are experiencing an acute
Блокада
lack of
сектора Газа
medicines. The
приобрела, по
blockade of
сути,
the Gaza
тотальный
Strip has
характер.
essentially become
В анклаве
total.
отключены
In the
интернет и
enclave,
мобильная связь.
internet
Он
and mobile service
попросту
has been
отрезан от
switched off. It
остального
has
мира.
been quite simply cut off from the
Никто
rest
не
of the
знает
world.
достоверно,
Nobody knows
что там сейчас
accurately
происходит.
what is exactly happening
Такая
there.
блокада не только
This
сеет
sort of
еще большую
blockade not
панику
only is
среди
sowing
людей,
greater panic among the
она
civilian
напрямую
population,
подрывает
it
работу
is directly
медицинских и
undermining the work
спасательных
of
служб,
medical and
а
rescue
значит,
services,
приведет к
which
новым
means it is
жертвам
leading
среди
to
гражданских
more
лиц.
civilian casualties.
По этой же причине не
For
удалось
this reason, it
согласовать
was not
проход
possible to
28
agree
октября
on the
очередного
28th of October for the passage of another
гумконвоя через
humanitarian convoy
КПП Рафах.
across the Rafah crossing
Категорически
point.
осуждаем
We
такие действия,
categorically
особенно в
condemn these
ситуации, когда
actions,
после
particularly in a
отключения связи
situation in which,
по анклаву
after
были
shutting off
нанесены самые
communications,
мощные с
the
начала
most
эскалации
powerful
авиаударов.
airstrikes were launched on the enclave since the beginning of this escalation.
В условиях активных боевых действий
In the
гуманитарное
conditions of
реагирование
active
остается
hostilities, the
фактически
humanitarian
нулевым.
response remains
Через
essentially nominal.
упомянутый КПП
Through
Рафах
the Rafah
единственный
crossing
путь
point, the
из
only
Египта
point
с 21
from
октября
Egypt,
прошли
from
всего
the since the
94
21st of
грузовика.
October, only
Причем,
94
по
trucks have
поступающим
made it through, and
свидетельствам,
according
Израиль
to incoming
препятствует даже
information,
этим
Israel is
сходным
even
путям.
timing these meager deliveries. As a result, in the Gaza Gaza Strip, there is an acute lack of everything: water, fuel, food, medicines, and people are frightened and have been driven to despair. On the 28th of October, upon the decision of the military political leadership of Israel, the armed forces of that country, ignoring the position clearly expressed by the international community in the UN General Assembly resolution adopted the previous day, began a ground operation in the Gaza Strip. After extremely intensive airstrikes, the Israeli army began to enter the territory of the enclave from several directions: in the south near Bureij refugee camp and Khan Yunis, and in the north near Beit Hanun. Colleagues, the Israeli authorities have different ways of describing their actions: expanding operations or preparing a bridgehead. But that's not the point. The point is that despite the unambiguous reaction around the world, West Jerusalem has begun the practical implementation of its plans to clear the enclave. In response, we have heard from the head of the Israeli Foreign Ministry saying that Israel rejects outright the UN's despicable call for a ceasefire, end quote. These comments did not go unnoticed as well. The comments from the permanent representative of Israel saying the UN has lost its legitimacy. There are shocking statements from a number of representatives in the Knesset that have been broadly circulated in the media saying that, and I quote, there is no symmetry in the Israeli response, and that, and I quote, the children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves, end quote. Unfortunately, this clearly shows that Israel is demonstratively ignoring the opinion of the overwhelming majority of UN members, including many Western states, regarding the need for an end to the violence. This appalling situation has also been brought about because, due to the US position, the Security Council has essentially been paralyzed and has still not been able to adopt a resolution with an immediate demand for a ceasefire. We have twice made attempts to do so, but Washington and Western Jerusalem have entirely other plans to wipe out the population of Gaza, or to force them out of the Gaza Strip, and to force the remaining Palestinian population to assimilate into Israel so as to resolve the Palestinian problem that way. In the context of the unprecedented scale of the escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we also have to note the current rise in tensions on the Syrian-Israeli border, which is linked to the active external interference coupled with the illegal military presence of the USA in the north and northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic. On the 26th of October, US forces, upon the instructions of President Joe Biden, launched strikes on 2 objects in the Abu Kamal area in the east of Syria. Washington said that the attack was undertaken in exercise of their so-called right to self-defense, American style. And this is thousands of kilometers from US territory. These illegitimate and in no way justified actions by Washington are nothing other than a gross violation of Syria's sovereignty and the norms of international law. In the present circumstances, such an illegitimate use of force could have extremely dangerous consequences because it could provoke an armed escalation encompassing the entire region. Colleagues, the time for half measures and half-hearted glib appeals is past. No humanitarian pauses will help. Humanitarian assistance cannot be provided in the height of hostilities on the ground. I hope that everyone here understands that. The number of victims among the humanitarian workers is running into the dozens. Ambulances have been bombed, and those that are left are unable to operate due to a lack of fuel. All noble humanitarian passages are, of course, important, but in and of themselves, they're not going to stop the war. The priority of the global community now is to stop the bloodshed, to minimize the harm to the civilian population, and to move the situation into the political diplomatic sphere. There must be a consolidation of collective efforts aimed at relaunching a fully fledged negotiating process between Israelis and Palestinians with the aim of realizing the UN-endorsed two-state solution. Upon the basis of that, an independent Palestinian state should be created in the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Mr. President, I would like to ask the permanent representative of the USA a question. Can you explain why you oppose a ceasefire? Does this mean that the USA, as a permanent member of the Security Council, supports the doctrine of massive retaliation in Gaza? Where is your compassion for civilians that you so eloquently express at every Security Council meeting on Ukraine? And that's even though the lives of civilians in Ukraine are far from facing the same level of threat as Palestinians in Gaza. Or is it that you only think about what's against those who are in the European continent, and that Palestinian lives don't stir any emotions in Washington. And I would like to put the same question to the other Western delegations in the Council, who shamefully abstained on all of our draft resolutions calling for a ceasefire. Colleagues, your double standards are more than evident. The populations of your own countries are now calling for an answer to that, where there are mass demonstrations in support of Palestine. In this situation, the Russian Federation is making intensive efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground, aimed at rapidly resolving the crisis. In all, we have sent a clear signal to all of the parties involved. There must immediately be an end to the fighting and the ensuring of humanitarian corridors for the emergency provision of humanitarian assistance to all those who need it. And President Putin has been extremely clear. We categorically will not accept and condemn any terrorist acts. We express condolences to all those who have lost their loved ones in Israel and in Palestine and in other countries. But while condemning terrorism and the taking of hostages and demanding their unconditional release, we categorically cannot agree that the threat of terrorism can be responded to while violating the norms of international humanitarian law, including the indiscriminate use of force on objects of civilian infrastructure where civilians are known to be located. And alongside addressing urgent tasks to end the current escalation of violence, we must immediately begin to agree on a strategy for collective actions for a political settlement of the conflict. In the past, this was done by the Quartet of International Mediators. However, the USA has done everything to undermine this effective instrument. On the agenda is establishing a collective mediating mechanism with an active role for states in the region. This is supported by the positive trends that before the previous escalation, the current escalation in Gaza were evident in the Middle East. The Saudi-Iranian normalization, the reintegration of Syria into the League of Arab States, and the steady improvement in interstate relations between Syria and Turkey. All of this proves, all of this proves that the countries in the region are, when they take the situation in hand and are not subjected to pressure from outside the region, they can achieve a great deal to stabilize the Middle East. Given the growing escalation in the Palestinian enclave and the unthinkably vast consequences for the civilian population, which is cut off from outside supplies, we believe it is important to hold regular open briefings such as the one today. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, without any discrimination, must remain within the focus of our constant attention as takes place in the context of other crises. Mr. President, some colleagues trying to shift the focus from the tragic events surrounding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict touched upon the 29th of October incident in Makhachkala airport in Dagestan in Russia. Exhaustive comments on this have already been provided by the Russian leadership and representatives of the regional authorities and the leadership. Assessing the actions will be provided by the investigative committee of Russia, which has launched criminal cases into this disorder. Dozens of people participating in this disorder have already been arrested and questioned. It's clear that any illegal actions are unacceptable. However, attempts to paint an unsanctioned action in the airport as an outbreak of anti-Semitic feeling in Russian society, particularly in the North Caucasus, is unacceptable. This region has long been an example of the peaceful and friendly coexistence of those from many different peoples. In Russian society, unlike Western societies, the principles of tolerance and religious and racial grounds are well rooted. In our society, there is the coexistence of the representatives of all of the main faiths: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. As is confirmed by data from the Russian security services, the events in Makhachkala are clearly seen, clearly show signs of external interference, including information interference through social networks, and the traces of that, you will be not surprised at all, come from Ukraine. Some wish to abuse the situation and play on the feelings of Muslims in Russia by showing terrible pictures from the Gaza Strip, showing the horrors that are taking place there, the deaths of women, older persons, children, and medical workers. I would recommend that some of our colleagues do not try to shift the blame, but rather that they pay attention to the situation in their own capitals, where there are many Muslim demonstrations that are being brutally put down by the police. This is an example of Western countries' commitment to multiculturalism and freedom of expression. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton for your stark and clear briefings. Let me start by recognizing the courage, commitment, and sacrifice of UN employees and humanitarian workers in Gaza, and in particular, the 103 aid workers, including the 64 UNRWA staff who have been killed in Gaza in the last 22 days. We also offer our sincere condolences to all Palestinians and Israelis who have suffered or lost loved ones. Since Hamas' terrorist attack against Israel on the 7th of October, the United Kingdom has underscored Israel's right to self-defense against terrorism. We continue to be clear that this must be done in accordance with international humanitarian law. Our efforts with our international partners have focused on the protection of civilians, securing and scaling up humanitarian access, and the release of hostages. Sadly, despite these efforts, the situation in Gaza deteriorates daily. Hamas bears sole responsibility for starting this conflict. President, I'd like to highlight 3 priorities. First, we call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law, including the principles of proportionality, distinction, and necessity. This requires all parties to take every possible step to avoid the harming of civilians and the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. Second, we must urgently cooperate to scale up aid into Gaza and to ensure sufficient access points are open. For this to happen successfully, there needs to be a safer environment, which necessitates humanitarian pauses. We support UN-led efforts in this regard. Since the latest escalation in Gaza, the UK has committed over $36 million in additional aid to the occupied Palestinian territories. An RAF flight arrived in Egypt on the 25th of October, carrying 21 tons of UK aid for Gaza. But the access environment needs to improve immediately so that these and other life-saving resources can reach the people who desperately need them. Third, we cannot allow this conflict to spread. We call on all countries in the region to help avoid escalation and warn non-state actors not to exploit the current situation. President, the Palestinian Authority has a key role as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. We call on Israel and other states to support the PA. We call on Israeli authorities to tackle the rising number of settler attacks and killings in the occupied West Bank, recalling that it is their responsibility to protect Palestinian civilians there. The UK retains the long-term goal of a 2-state solution with Israel and Palestine coexisting peacefully. To reach that goal, we have a responsibility to ensure a plan for Gaza that offers the population hope, security, stability, prosperity, and effective governance so that their political wishes can be fulfilled. In this regard, some fundamental principles apply. There should be no mass displacement of Gazans to neighboring countries. The Palestinian Authority should play a central role, and nothing should be done that cuts across progress towards a two-state solution, with Gaza as an integral part of a Palestinian state. Thank you, President.
I thank the permanent representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Japan.
I thank Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini and UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton for your briefings. I join other colleagues in expressing our respect to all humanitarian actors who are tirelessly working under unimaginable conditions. Mr. President, since October 7th, thousands of people have been killed and wounded. The tragic sequence of events shows no signs of abating, descending further into a devastating cycle with unimaginable losses of life and the destruction of civilian facilities. Just recently, Israel announced the expansion of its ground operations in Gaza. Japan has been paying careful attention to the situation with grave concern. Japan has expressed unequivocal condemnation to the terror attacks committed by Hamas and other militants and extends its sincere condolences to all victims. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. The international community should never tolerate such a heinous act. Hamas does not speak for the Palestinian people. Every member state has the right to defend itself and its people in accordance with international law. At the same time, all parties must act based on international law. The deterioration of the situation in Gaza has led to a deepened humanitarian crisis to an unprecedented level of severity. The loss of any more innocent lives, regardless of their nationalities, religions, or ethnicities, is simply unacceptable. No one's life is more important or less important than that of others. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, consistent with international humanitarian law, must be allowed in order to alleviate the devastating humanitarian situation. While several trucks have crossed through the Rafah crossing, hundreds more must follow suit to meet the dire need of over 2 million people. And in this context, we should also take further steps immediately, including humanitarian pauses and establishment of humanitarian corridors. Additionally, we express our profound concern regarding the disconnection of the telecommunications networks, which disrupts vital communication channels between those in Gaza and the rest of the world, and also impedes the work of media and humanitarian communities. It is especially imperative to ensure these networks function to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance and the safety of humanitarian workers. As the situation is rapidly evolving, it is critical for all parties in the region to avoid exacerbating this conflict. The international community has a duty to redouble its diplomatic efforts in order to prevent the instability from spilling over into the region and to calm the situation with a sense of urgency. The Security Council needs to act urgently to find a common ground among all Council members to deliver a meaningful message and help to all parties, to all in distress. While we remain unable to act, lives are being lost day by day, minute by minute. We must also recall that ultimately there is no alternative to a two-state solution. All parties must make serious efforts to this end. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Japan for his statement, and I give the floor to the permanent representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for giving me the floor. And let me begin by thanking Commissioner General Lazzarini Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton for their briefings on the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza following the resurgence of conflict in the Middle East after the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel on 7th of October. 23 days after the attacks in southern Israel, with the attendant loss of lives and abductions, we are appalled by the many lives that are being lost in the ensuing conflict, as well as its humanitarian consequences. We are equally concerned by the potential spread of the conflict to the wider region and the heavy toll that it bodes for innocent civilian populations. Last Friday, within the context of the resumed 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly, majority of the members of this organization, through the residual rule of the Assembly, called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce, demanded of all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, and asserted the need for continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential supplies and services into the Gaza Strip. It also called for the immediate and unconditional release of all civilians held captive and demanded their safety, well-being, and humane treatment in compliance with international law. Taking into account what the Assembly has said, we must, as a Council, build upon the convergence of views on this crisis to support the Secretary General, UN agencies, and staff, including UNRWA, to deliver critical care and support services to the nearly 672,000 internally displaced persons sheltering in the 149 UNRWA facilities, as well as the many other innocent civilians who are living under desperate conditions. From recent reports of UNRWA, the number of trucks that are allowed into Gaza will need to be scaled up significantly if we are to make any impact in addressing the desperate humanitarian needs of the 2 million people in Gaza, especially in the health and food security components and the supporting supply needs. In this context, we appeal to Israel, Egypt, and other stakeholders to work constructively towards enhanced humanitarian access through the Rafah border crossing, and to all donors to step up financial and material contributions to UNRWA to meet the growing and urgent humanitarian needs of the people of Gaza. We must also use the weight of the Assembly's decision to strenuously encourage the efforts of leaders in the region, especially Qatar, as well as the ICRC, that have been at the forefront of negotiations to secure the release of all Israeli and foreign hostages, to impress upon the Hamas militia to heed the demand of the international community for the immediate and unconditional release of all captured civilians. Holding innocent civilian populations as captives is wrong and unacceptable, regardless of the motives. Mr. President, the past 23 days has also been one of blood, pain, and anguish, as we have not seen in the region in recent times. Not to make further efforts to stop the fighting would be truly tragic. We encourage regional and international leaders to act as moderating influence on the parties to help de-escalate the conflict and prevent its further spread in the region. The impact of the conflict on women, children, and the elderly has been enormous, and we owe it to them on both sides to bring this crisis to an end. In concluding, we reiterate our condolences for all lives lost and remind the Palestinian and the Israeli people of their interwoven history and shared geography, both ancient and modern. The experiences of the past should reinforce the realization that violence cannot be the tool for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Indeed, neither the security interest of Israel nor the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for their homeland can be secured by violence. For Ghana, and as often repeated, we hold the view that a deepened commitment to a negotiated two-state solution on the basis of the 1967 borders offers the best prospects for peace and stability in the Middle East. We hope that in furtherance of this Council's responsibilities, we can find a consensus to end this conflict, bring the parties to the table of dialogue, and help deliver a secure and assured statehood for both Israel and Palestine sooner rather than later. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Ghana for his statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. My apologies for taking the floor, but I need to respond to some comments made by the Russian permanent representative. Since the beginning of this conflict, the Russian Federation has spared no moment trying to either directly or indirectly blame the United States for this crisis. It is irresponsible. It is false that we are responsible in some way for what is going on. No state has worked harder than the United States to try to resolve this situation, and we continue to work hard to do so. This is a typical Russian narrative that has, again, no basis in fact. Russia, frankly, has no credibility. Its prevarication knows no bounds. It claims to care about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I think it's pretty clear. Russia doesn't care about solving crises, humanitarian crises. It creates them. If you have any doubts, just look what's going on in Ukraine. Regarding U.S. actions in Syria, we responded to attacks against U.S. personnel acting in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. I think Russia will recall the UN Charter. It has been working to drive a stake through the heart of this sacred document through everything that's been doing in Ukraine. So let me just close by saying, Mr. President, the United States will continue its efforts to do what it can to ease the situation in the region. And my hope is that Russia will step up and be a responsible player in the Security Council and work with the international community to try to bring about an end to this very, very sad situation. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. The permanent representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Спасибо, господин
Thank
председатель.
you,
Я
Mr. President.
буду краток.
I'll be brief.
Расцениваю последний комментарий своего
Taking
американского
stock of the
коллеги
latest comment from my
как
American
признание.
colleague as an
На
admittance.
вопрос, который мы поставили, мы ответа не
We
услышали.
didn't hear a
Даже на
response
вопросы, я бы
to the
сказал.
question that we put to
Хотел бы
him.
задать ему
But I would like
риторический
to
вопрос,
put a rhetorical question
на
to
который
him,
я не требую ответа,
which I
потому что
don't
вопрос
require an
риторический,
answer
и
to because it's a
ответ на
rhetorical
него и так
question
очевиден.
and the answer
Сколько раз
is
Соединенные
obvious
Штаты
anyway.
за
How
время
many
последнего
times
кризиса, да и в
during
предыдущее
the
время
present
инициировали заседание
crisis has the
по
United
гуманитарной
States
ситуации
initiated a
в Газе?
meeting on the humanitarian situation in Gaza? Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, I want to begin by welcoming you to this chamber and to leading the deliberation of this emergency meeting requested by our colleagues from the United Arab Emirates and China, which we appreciate. The fact that you are with us for the third time during this month is an illustration of the commitment of Brazil at the level of the foreign minister. And I am sure with the urgency from President Lula to do everything that you can in order to bring about the end of this carnage and the tragedy that the Palestinian people are going through, particularly in the Gaza Strip. We, the Palestinian people and the state of Palestine, and our people everywhere, particularly in the Gaza Strip, and our leadership, do really appreciate this commitment, this effort that Brazil is doing. And I am personally delighted to see you for the third time because I consider you as a good friend from the time when we worked together as permanent representatives of our states. I want also to thank the three briefers Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Ms. Russell, and Director Ms. Doughton for their briefings and for their moving calls. And it is coming from people who are in the field, leading teams in the field trying to save lives of the Palestinian people. We don't only express our gratitude and appreciation for what they do, and also receive with them accepting condolences for those who have lost their lives and paid the ultimate price for trying to save the life of the Palestinian people. They are the best faces of the United Nations. They are the best among us, led by a hero by the name of Guterres, who stood outside the Rafah crossing and made his brave humanitarian call: have a peaceful ceasefire, allow humanitarian convoys to reach everywhere in the Gaza Strip to save lives, to put an end to this war, and to save hospitals, to save every institution that is providing life for our people. Those are the best faces of the United Nations. And if they are in fact the best faces, which we truly believe, and we express our gratitude to them, I believe we have to listen to everything that they have said, and to listen to their important call and requests: humanitarian ceasefire and humanitarian convoys up to scale, as the Secretary General requested, of a minimum of 100 truckloads every day. If we genuinely respect their calls and what they are doing, let us not only listen closely to them, but to implement their request. And with that spirit, allow me, Mr. President, to deliver my statement. Mr. President, Dag Hammarskjöld said, and I quote, "The United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell." End of quotation. Gaza is now hell on earth. You've heard that not from me. You've heard it from Lazzarini and many others. Gaza is now hell on earth. Saving humanity from hell today means for the United Nations to save Palestinians in Gaza. The 2.3 million Palestinians living there are enduring suffering that no human beings should endure. They are besieged and bombed with nowhere safe to go. Again, you heard Lazzarini. He said there is no safe place in the Gaza Strip. Half the homes in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged. Gaza population is comprised of 70% of refugees. Over 1.4 million Palestinians have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Again, Mr. Lazzarini. Now, virtually all of our people in Gaza are homeless, displaced, moving from one family home to another, from a hospital to a church, from a mosque to an UNRWA school, sleeping in their cars, sleeping in the streets, and still being killed wherever they go, to convince them they will not be safe anywhere in Gaza. A leaked document prepared by the Israeli intelligence ministry, confirms that, in fact, relocating Palestinians from Gaza to 10 cities in Sinai is not a threat we imagined, but a reality Israel is trying to impose. They want to depopulate the Gaza Strip completely from the entire population and throw them in the lap of Egypt in the Sinai Desert. Over 8,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 3,000 in the south of Gaza, where Israel has forcibly transferred hundreds of thousands of people. These staggering figures keep rising with every minute that action is delayed to stop the onslaught against our people. One figure more than any other explains the magnitude of this man-made tragedy. 3,500 Palestinian children have been killed by Israel in just 3 weeks, more than the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones since 2019, according to Save the Children, as my sister, the minister from United Arab Emirates, Her Excellency Lana, has alluded to. Let me repeat, 3,500 Palestinian children have been killed by Israel in just 3 weeks, more than the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones combined since 2019. Every 5 minutes, a Palestinian child is killed. How many more days will you wait to say enough? How many more days will you wait to say enough? Paralyzed, not acting, not carrying out your duty to maintain international peace and security and to stop that war as a derivative of that. To recognize this is a war against our children. How long will it take you to recognize that thousands of children being killed before your own eyes and you're still paralyzed? Our children who are like yours, children of God, children of light, the angels on earth. Enough darkness, enough death. Save lives of our children and all children and the children of others. Mr. President, the General Assembly, representing the countries of the world, adopted a resolution grounded in humanity, morality, legality, and the rejection of double standards and of any justification for the killing of innocent civilians, the siege against them, their captivity, and their forced transfer. It took a stand that we will not forsake humanity. We will not forfeit international law. The General Assembly acted. The Secretary General acted. The army of his humanitarian agencies and the heroes leading them and those who are working in implementing that message acted. And there is one important body still not acting. It is you. The General Assembly called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce. This must happen immediately. It stressed that humanitarian aid and access cannot be further delayed or obstructed and must be at levels that correspond to the immense needs created by this inhumane Israeli siege and the indiscriminate attacks it is perpetrating as we speak. Thousands more lives hang in the balance. This resolution, moral one, powerful one, in which 11 of you, members of the Security Council, voted for. 3 of you abstained. 1 voted no. This resolution must be immediately and fully implemented. If you were able to vote in the General Assembly, what is stopping you from voting here? The 11 who voted yes, the 3 who abstained, among them 4 permanent members voted yes and 1 abstention. Do what the bigger body is doing. Rise up to your responsibility and what you should do instead of dragging the paralysis, I don't know for how long, while thousands of Palestinian innocent civilians, including children, being slaughtered. The Security Council must take example of the General Assembly and its wisdom and uphold its responsibilities to put an end to this bloodshed, which constitute an affront to humanity, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and a clear and imminent danger for regional and international peace and security. I want to thank the Arab group led by my brother, Ambassador Mahmoud of Jordan, who has demonstrated an outstanding leadership in leading our group during this very difficult month. And we salute him. And the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and its foreign minister, who was with us, participating in what we've accomplished together with all of you, with many of you in the General Assembly. And the OIC member states for their relentless mobilization. The countries of the Global South for their support, as well as all the countries which engaged constructively and responsibly to allow us to adopt a substantive humanitarian resolution with overwhelming support from across the globe. 121 countries versus 14. Given that 11 members of this council have voted in favor of the resolution, that 3 abstained and 1 voted against, it is clear that the text enjoys broad support and must serve as basis for a clear and unequivocal position of the Council at this critical juncture. Mr. President, 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza face death every day and every night. Save them. Save them. Look at them as human beings. You cannot look only at one side and ignore this tragic humanity completely. Wake up from revenge. Look at us as human beings. Save them. We have 2,000 people under the rubble. Allow us to find them. Save those who still can be saved, and bury in a dignified manner those who have perished. Allow the 20,000 wounded to be properly treated. Allow doctors to fix broken bodies, and God to heal wounded souls. Allow humanitarian workers, the brave ones, the heroes, to perform their life-saving duties, even as they mourn their colleagues. 64 alone among UNRWA as staff killed in Israeli attacks. Allow them to conduct their sacred mission in safety and not under the bombs. Allow hospitals to resume their work to save lives and not be transformed into morgues. Allow members of the same families who have survived to embrace each other and to mourn their loved ones who did not. Allow us to pay the tribute owed to the families wiped off the face of this earth and whose names join the long list of bereaved families etched in our collective memory. Allow people who will have homes standing to go home, and allow millions of people to start thinking once more about how to rebuild their lives despite the depths of the death, devastation, and destruction they endured, despite the indelible traumas. Treat us as human beings with the respect we deserve. We are not subhuman beings. We are not from another planet. We are exactly like each and every one of you. We are humans, human beings. Treat us in this manner with respect we deserve. Show respect for our inherent dignity, not in words, but in deeds, in action, in doing something to stop this crime against our people and our children and our women and our wounded and our sick. No one should justify our killing or find reasons to give more time to the killer. Call for an end of this assault on an entire nation. Stop the killings in the West Bank by settlers and occupation forces and the forced displacement underway there. Palestinians, as human beings, have rights that must be upheld, and they are entitled to protection, and we are entitled to be defended. Many of you talk about one narrative, about one state to defend itself. When our children are being killed, do we have the right to defend them? Do we have the right to defend our families? Do we have the right to defend our schools? Do we have the right to defend our mosques? Do we have the right to defend our churches? Do we have the right to defend our homes and our soil and our nation? Do we have rights? Or rights only the monopoly of one side? Our people have, as a people, rights that have long been denied and must now be recognized so we can all live in peace and security. No assault or war will ever end this conflict or resolve this injustice. It will only deepen and widen it. We have said time and time again, there is no military solution to this conflict. We are yet to demonstrate there is a peaceful one. And I listen to you all the time. And you tell me about the two-state solution. And you repeat it. And you repeat it. And you repeat it. But you don't tell me what single step you are willing to take in order to stop the other side from destroying the two-state solution before your eyes. Isn't it enough to wake up and say the resolution that you adopted that calls for the implementation of the two-state solution show resolve to implement these resolutions? You are the Security Council. Are you continuing to be paralyzed, or you want to act on the advice you're giving me? You're giving the Palestinian people. Two-state solution, we accepted. Implement it. Who is stopping you from implementing it? Who is stopping you from taking steps in order to push the occupation to an end, to allow for the independence of the state of Palestine? Who is stopping you? Don't keep repeating to me two-state solution. Tell me how you are going to defend it and how you are going to implement it, so that can our people believe you and have faith in what you are saying and respect what you call for when they see you marching toward the implementation. And whoever is standing on the path of the implementation of your will should be removed from the way so that we can see the implementation of the two-state solution based on your resolutions, based on international law, based on the terms of reference. You agreed to all these things, but you're not acting. You keep repeating them, and you think by repeating them, you did your duty. No, you have to do more. You have to take the practical steps for allowing the two-state solution to become a reality. We have said time and time again, I repeat, there is no military solution to this conflict. We are yet to demonstrate there is a peaceful one. Prove us wrong. Every minute counts. Every minute is the difference between life and death for Palestinians in Gaza. And I thank you very much, Mr. President, and I hope that there is a short period of time till the end of this, your presidency. But if by any miracle that you can have a position from the Security Council to stop this war and to allow the hundreds of trucks with humanitarian assistance to enter the Gaza Strip, we will tip our hat to you and to the Security Council members. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the State of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished council members, my grandfather, Chaim, was a farmer. He lived in a small village in Transylvania with his wife Bracha and their 8 beautiful children. But in the spring of 1944, the small village ceased to exist. Their community was erased. The Nazis forced Chaim, Bracha, and their children, 8 children, onto cattle cars hurtling towards Auschwitz. Upon arrival, Bracha and 7 of their children, Pearl, Tzvi, Sarah, Hodaya, Leah, Henya, and little baby Mordechai, were murdered in the gas chambers and turned to ash. My grandfather's story was once a horror story of a different era, of a distant time of unfathomable hatred, a time which, until 3 weeks ago, we referred to as never again. Yet, never again happened again. The villages in southern Israel that were invaded by Hamas terrorists were peaceful agricultural villages, just like my grandfather's village in Transylvania. Entire communities were exterminated. Only this time, the murderers were Hamas Nazis. Entire Israeli families were turned into smoke and ash, no different than the fate that my grandfather's family met in Auschwitz. But the brutality of the crimes is not the only thing that the savage Hamas Nazis share with the German Nazis. They both share a common ideology, and it's not the two-state solution. The Einsatzgruppen Nazi death squads were committed to exterminating the Jews, just as the Nukhba, Hamas terrorists, are committed to exterminating the Jews and Israel. The Nazis sought a Judenrein, Jew-free Europe, just as Hamas seeks a Judenrein Israel. Hamas are modern-day Nazis, from their appalling, inhumane violence to identical genocidal ideologies. Hamas is not seeking a solution to the conflict. They are not interested in dialogue. The only solution Hamas is interested in is the final solution, the annihilation of the Jewish people. And may I remind my colleague, they are the rulers of Gaza, not you. Yet Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, is no Adolf Hitler. He is not the Führer. He is not the leader of this genocidal death cult hell-bent on world domination. That role, dear colleagues, and you know it very well, is held by the supreme leader of Iran, the bloodthirsty Ayatollah Khamenei. Hitler's Third Reich was envisioned to be a 1,000-year empire stretching across continents, just as Khamenei envisions his radical Shiite hegemony to stretch across the region and beyond. The Ayatollah regime is the modern Nazi regime, and their death squads includes Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Revolutionary Guard, and other savage jihadists. Instead of shouting, Sieg Heil, these radical Nazi Islamists scream, death to Israel, death to America, death to England. You could see it on the Khamenei's Twitter account. Just like the Nazi regime, the Ayatollah regime sows death and destruction everywhere it touches. Just as the French under the Vichy or the Italian under Mussolini, the residents of Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, and Syria are enduring indescribable bloodshed and terror at the hands of Iran's jihadist Nazi forces. Like the suffering of Londoners during the Blitzkrieg, Ukrainian civilians are being murdered from the skies with Iranian Nazi weaponry. Like the ever-reaching hand of the Wehrmacht, the Houthi Iranian proxy attacked Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and Albania was struck by unprovoked Iranian cyber attacks. The Islamic Nazi regime of Iran is responsible for aiding terrorists around the globe and working towards destroying every value our civilized world holds dear. Today, the world is watching the rise of a Shia Islamist Reich. Yet, just like the rise of Nazism, the world is silent. Deafeningly silent. Even if you continue calling this meeting the situation in the Middle East and the Palestinian question for the rest of time, it will not make it any truer. This meeting is only about the situation in the Middle East and the Iranian threat. This has nothing to do with the Palestinians. 3 weeks ago, humanity witnessed Iran's Hamas death squads in action. Like Babi Yar, they exterminated Jews in the hundreds like they were insects. Hamas Nazis deliberately sliced open the pregnant belly of a woman, removed her fetus, and stabbed it before its mother's eyes while she was still alive. But even so, the Security Council still has not condemned Hamas for the intentional murder of Israeli civilians. Unbelievable. Over 250,000 innocent Israeli civilians have been displaced since the war began. Millions of Israelis are living every day under constant indiscriminate rocket fire, both in the south and the north, at the hands of Hamas, Hezbollah, and other jihadists. Does this council not have anything to say about this? Is this not also part of the situation in the Middle East? Council members, when my grandfather Chaim and his children were sent to Auschwitz, the world stayed silent. When his babies were sent to the gas chambers, the world stayed silent. When their bodies were burned along millions of other Jewish children, not only Jewish, the world was silent. Today, after innocent Jewish babies were burned alive, this council is still silent. Some member states have learned nothing in the past 80 years. Some of you have forgotten why this body was established. So I will remind you, from this day on, each time you look at me, you will remember what staying silent in the face of evil means. Just like my grandparents and the grandparents of millions of Jews, from now on, my team and I will wear yellow stars. We will wear this star until you condemn the atrocities of Hamas and demand the immediate release of our hostages. We walk with a yellow star as a symbol of pride, a reminder that we swore to fight back, to defend ourselves. Never again is now. Council members, in the face of the UN's silence, our enemies have become emboldened. They have seen the UN General Assembly applauding efforts to prevent the Jews from defending ourselves. They heard the Secretary General portray understanding for the Nazi slaughter. And this is precisely why we have seen the most staggering rise in Jew hatred since the Nuremberg laws and their aftermath. The anti-Semites have been empowered. They now know that slaughtering Jews in their beds is met with silence. They have been so galvanized by these organizations in action that they cannot wait to butcher Jews themselves. Calls for gassing the Jews are heard in Sydney. Chants for a Judenrein Palestine from the river to the sea can be heard from California to New York. Islamist battle cries against Jews are being screamed in London, Brussels, and Paris. An airport in Dagestan, Russia, was flooded yesterday by Islamist terror supporters who search for Jews to lynch. This is precisely where the world stood as the Nazis began their rampage. Precisely the same moment. And then, too, the world was silent. Understand where we are right now. Comprehend the weight of this moment. Internalize that the world stands at the crossroad just as it did in the 1930s. Would this council take the approach of Chamberlain, appease the Nazis and their sympathizers? Or will this council take the approach of Churchill to fight evil with blood, toil, tears, and sweat? Israel has made its choice. We were attacked by the Hamas Nazis. We were shown to defend ourselves against those that seek to annihilate us. In the days leading up to and following the October 7th massacre, Simchat Torah massacre, the Führer Khamenei continued to spread his poisonous genocidal ideologies with the world. He tweeted about the end of Israel. He said that whoever normalizes relations with Israel would lose. He claimed that Israel is dying, and on the day of the massacre, he called for the eradication of Israel alongside a video of Israelis running for their lives as his Hamas Einsatzgruppen mowed them down with machine guns. Colleagues, if Hitler had a Twitter account, it would look exactly the same as Khamenei's. Exactly. Shockingly, despite the blatant genocidal Nazism of the Islamic Reich of Iran, the Secretary General and UN officials who are being applauded here are still meeting with Iranian officials without saying one word of condemnation for their support of genocide. What a disgrace. The Secretary General rolled out the red carpet for the Iranian Nazi foreign minister here in this very building last week, smiling and shaking his blood-soaked hand. Secretary Gutierrez, aside from empty words paid as lip service for media purposes, has not publicly demanded even once that ISIS-Hamas terrorists allow the Red Cross to, at the very least, verify some sign of life of the hostages, to condition that without such a step, Hamas will be held accountable for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. How can this be? Why are the humanitarian needs of Gazans the sole issue? The sole issue you are all focused on. Is this not the bare minimum that must be called for from these monsters? Where is this council's voice as a council? Hamas Nazis have spent the past 16 years ruling Gaza. 16 years abusing Palestinians and butchering anyone who opposes them. When Hamas took power in Gaza in 2007, you all know it very well, they murdered hundreds of Palestinians with their own hands. They threw them off rooftops. They used Palestinians as human shields, building terror bases under hospitals and missile launchers next to schools. What do you expect us to do? They hoard medical supplies, food and fuel for themselves when these resources could benefit their people. I assume Lazzarini forgot to tell you about it. They also deleted the tweet that was telling you about it. Their leaders live in luxury in Doha and Istanbul. They don't even live in the Gaza Strip, their leaders, as their people live in poverty. Hamas ISIS terrorists are operating inside and under hospitals, including Shifa Hospital, which houses their command center. I reiterate it. Hamas is preventing Gazans from living an active war zone by heading south. Hamas is holding roughly 500,000 liters of fuel right now as we speak next to Rafah crossing. Everything can be checked. In any discussion about lack of fuel, your demands should be directed at Hamas. Israel has approved dozens of more than dozens, of daily trucks of humanitarian supplies, including food, water, and medical equipment. But Israel refuses to supply the enemy, Hamas, with any aid in accordance with international law. Hamas is the root cause of the situation in Gaza. Yet, you continue to insist on calling this meeting a discussion of the Palestinian question. Can anyone here provide a solution to the Palestinian question as long as Hamas controls Gaza? Calling for an immediate ceasefire is ultimately asking to tie Israel's hands and keep Hamas's rule in Gaza. Is this the future that you want for the people of Gaza? I'm sorry to say, but should this council have existed on June 6, 1944, it would be intensely debating how much electricity and fuel the citizens of Munich had as the Allies approached the shores of Normandy. This council would be fixated on debating the death toll of Germans versus British casualties. This council would be calling for a ceasefire before the Russians retook Stalingrad. We all know Hamas's intentions, and we all know that should they be given another chance, they will commit such atrocities again over and over and over, but this time on a much larger scale. Yet this organization, founded in the wake of the Holocaust, fails to act on its founding principles. Calling for a ceasefire is no different than calling off D-Day in 1944. Dear colleagues, Israel will no longer live with brutal Hamas Nazis on her border. We will not have savage ISIS-Hamas death squads invading our homeland again. Israel's operation in Gaza is not, I reiterate, is not a response to October 7th. It is an act of self-defense to ensure our future. Mr. President, the Israeli people are strong. We are unbreakable, and we are going nowhere. Many have tried to destroy us. The Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Nazis, to name just a few. But none have succeeded. And the Iranian Reich will be no different. Israel will prevail, God willing. We will bring our hostages home, and the citizens of the Jewish state will live in peace and freedom. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of the State of Israel for his statement. And now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Jordan.
Thank you, Excellency. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد
In the name of
الرئيس
God
أود أن
Almighty,
أشكر
Mr. President,
السيد
I
فيليب
would like to thank
لازايريني
Mr.
المفوض العام
Philippe Lazzarini, the Commissioner
للأنروا
General
والسيدة
of
كاثرين
UNRWA.
راسل
I thank Ms.
المديرة
Catherine
التنفيذية
Russell, the Executive
لليونيسف
Director of UNICEF,
والسيدة
and Ms.
ليزا
Lisa
دوتن
Doughton,
من الأوتشا.
Director from OCHA.
يشرفني أن أدلي بهذا البيان
I
نيابة
am
عن
pleased to
المجموعة
make the
العربية
statement on
الموقرة
behalf
في
of
نيويورك.
the Arab group in New
نخاطب
York.
مجلسكم الكريم
We address the Council
اليوم في
today
جلسته
in
الطارئة
this
هذه بعد أن
emergency
صوت
session
أعضاء الجمعية العامة
after
للأمم
the
المتحدة
members of the General
قبل
Assembly
بضعة
of the
أيام
United Nations
بالموافقة على تبني
have
قرار
voted
ضمن
to
أعمال
adopt
الدورة
a resolution
الاستثنائية
as
الطارئة
part
العاشرة
of the
العامة حول
10th
الأعمال
emergency
الإسرائيلية غير
session of the
القانونية في
General
القدس
Assembly
الشرقية
on the
والأراضي
Israeli
الفلسطينية
illegal
المحتلة
actions in East
والذي قام
Jerusalem and
الأردن
the occupied
بتقديمه
Palestinian
بصفته
territory
رئيس
that
المجموعة
Jordan
العربية
co-sponsored
للشهر
as
الجاري.
the chair of
سيد
the Arab
الرئيس
group for
لقد
October. Mr. President,
توجهت المجموعة
the Arab
العربية
group
ومنظمة التعاون
and the
الإسلامي
OIC
بالطلب من
have
رئاسة
submitted a
الجمعية
request
العامة
to the
باستئناف
PGA
أعمال
to
اللجنة
resume
الطارئة
the
العاشرة
G8 10th
للجمعية
emergency
بعد أن
special
بدا واضحا
session
عدم قدرة
after
مجلس
it
الأمن
has been very
منذ
evident
نشوب
that the
الحرب
Security Council
أوائل
since
الشهر
the
الجاري
start of
على
the war
الاقتلاع
in
بمسؤوليته
October
في صون الأمن
have not been
والسلم
able to shoulder
الدوليين
its responsibility
وقف الحرب
towards the
على
maintenance
أهلنا
of
في
international peace
غزة.
and security and stop the
السيد
war against
الرئيس
our people in Gaza.
إن
Mr.
تبني
President,
الجمعية العامة
the
لقرارها
adoption by
هذا
the
قد
GA
عكس
of this
رسالة
resolution
هامة
has sent a
وصريحة
clear message
مفادها أن
that the
المجتمع
international
الدولي
community
قد وقف مع العدالة
has
ومع
stood
حماية
with justice
المدنيين
and the
الأبرياء
protection of innocent
ومع
civilians
التمسك
and
بالالتزامات
adherence to
القانونية
legal,
والإنسانية
humanitarian,
والشرعية
and legitimate
ومع الوقف الفوري
obligations,
للحرب
and with
الإسرائيلية
the immediate
المستعرة على
stop
غزة
of the raging
ووقف
Israeli
جرائم
war against
الحرب
Gaza,
وقتل الأبرياء العزل
ending war crimes
ووقف
and the
وتدمير
killing of
المنازل
defenseless innocent
والمرافق
civilians
المدنية
and ending the destruction
والمستشفيات
of homes,
ودور العبادة
civil
والبنى
facilities,
التحتية.
hospitals, houses of worship, and infrastructure.
وإذا كان هذا القرار متحيزا
And
لأحد أو
if this
لشيء
resolution is
فهو
biased
متحيز
towards
للحق
anything or anyone, it is
والعدالة
biased towards
والإنسانية.
justice, humanity, and right.
وقد نجحنا في مواجهة
We were
بعض
able
المحاولات
to
لتسييس ذلك
address a
القرار.
number of attempts to politicize this resolution.
سيد الرئيس،
Mr. President,
يتضمن قرار الجمعية
the General
العامة
Assembly
جملة أمور لا
resolution
بد من
includes a number
توفرها
of elements that need to
حتى
be
يتم
provided
إيجاد أفق
so that we
لإنهاء
can
هذه
find a
الحرب.
horizon to ending this war.
أولاً،
One,
هدنة إنسانية
call for an
فورية
immediate,
ودائمة
durable, and sustained
ومستدامة
humanitarian
تقضي
truce
إلى وقف
leading to a
للأعمال
cessation
الفدائية
of
بشكل فوري
hostilities immediately,
وحماية جميع
and
المرافق
the
المدنية
protection
ذات
of
الأغراض
all
الإنسانية
humanitarian
بما
civil
فيها
facilities,
المستشفيات ودور
including
العبادة.
hospitals and houses of worship.
ثانياً،
Two,
امتثال الأطراف كافة
demands that all
بالالتزامات
parties
التي تقع
comply
على
with
عاتقها
their
بموجب
obligations
القانون
under
الدولي بما
international
في
law,
ذلك القانون الدولي
including
الإنساني.
international humanitarian law.
ثالثاً، ضمان
3,
المساعدات الإنسانية
provision
من
of
إمدادات
humanitarian
وخدمات
assistance,
أساسية
including
إلى
supplies
جميع
and
المدنيين
basic services
المحتاجين
to
لها
all
في قطاع غزة.
civilians that need them in the Gaza Strip.
رابعاً، الرفض القاطع
4,
لأي محاولة تستهدف
firmly
نقل
rejecting
السكان
any attempt
المدنيين
at the forced
الفلسطينيين نقلاً
transfer of
قسرياً
the Palestinian
والدعوة إلى
civilian
الإخراج الفوري وغير
population
المشروط
and the
عن
call
جميع
for the
المدنيين
immediate and
الموجودين
unconditional
رهن
release of all
الاحتجاز
civilians who are being
بصورة غير
illegally
قانونية.
held captive.
السيد الرئيس،
Mr. President,
تطالب المجموعة
the
المجتمع
Arab
الدولي
group
ببذل
calls that the
جهودها
international
بذل جهوده
community
للضغط على
make effort
إسرائيل
to
بشكل
bring
حازم
pressure to
وكي
bear on
تتوقف
Israel
عن
decisively
مماطلتها في إدخال
to stop
المساعدات
stalling
بما يسمح
vis-a-vis the
بعبورها
entrance of
بشكل عاجل
assistance so that it
وبكميات
would
كافية
be provided in adequate quantities immediately to address the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. Here, we would like to say that the number of trucks that accessed the Gaza Strip since the beginning of the war through the Rafah crossing is no more than 85 trucks, compared to more than 500 trucks that used to daily enter the Gaza Strip before the war. This is as a result of Israel obstructing these trucks. Here, we stress that the Arab Republic of Egypt has not spared any effort to ensure the expeditious delivery of aid and humanitarian assistance to the brothers and sisters in Gaza, despite the operational and logistical obstacles by Israel in the way of access for political considerations and false security pretexts, and Israel's continued threatening to shell the Rafah crossing. Mr. President, the continuation of the raging Israeli war against Gaza and the ensuing humanitarian disaster threatens a spillover effect into the region. Here, we warn against this impact and its repercussions on the security and stability of the region and the whole world. Here, we call for a cessation of Israeli aggression on Syrian territory and a cessation on the Lebanese borders and a cessation of Israeli violations on villages in the south of Lebanon that has led to the displacement of 30,000 Lebanese and has killed more than 50 individuals, in addition to directly targeting the centers of the Lebanese armed forces and UNIFIL and the killing of journalists. Mr. President, the war on Gaza is in a new phase, bringing more destruction, killing, and oppression against the people of Gaza. Way more than what we have seen in the past few days. And when the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Jordan, Mr. Safadi, when he spoke at the Council last Tuesday, the total number of casualties of Palestinian civilians was 6,000 martyrs. Today, less than a week after that, the number of victims is 8,300 martyrs, including more than 3,400 children and 2,100 women, in addition to more than 2,000 individuals under the rubble for so many days now. The killing will not stop as long as Israel hears from some justifications for its crimes. It is given coverage, protection, without any accountability. Unfortunately, as long as this cover-up continues, as long as silence on its actions continues, Israel will be emboldened and will continue to commit such acts in total impunity. Mr. President, isn't it time for human conscience to wake up to the scenes that we watch every day, every minute, every hour? Carnage, destruction in Gaza. Isn't it time for this council to heed the cries for help from the people of Gaza? They have no safe place to go to shelter from the Israeli bombardment and its destruction. Their homes, their hospitals, and their houses of worship have come down tumbling on their heads while they're inside, and even UN facilities have been also shelled. 1.4 million of the people of Gaza have left their homes and their neighborhoods. This deafening silence needs to stop. Isn't it time for the Council to heed the calls of human conscience? And we thank the Secretary General for his words, despite all the attacks that he unfairly is at the receiving end of, when he calls for a ceasefire and the delivery of medical and humanitarian aid and the respect of international law and the protection of civilians and UN aid agencies. I don't know why is he being attacked. for
مواقف
these
العدل الذي
positions, these
يستند
fair
إليها.
positions of His Excellency the Secretary
أما
General.
آن لمجلسكم
Isn't it
الموقر أن
time
يغلب
for your
مبادئ العدالة
council to
والإنسانية
give
وأن يقول لإسرائيل
prevalence
أن
to the
الترانسفير
principles
جريمة
of justice and
لا يمكن
humanity,
أن تمر
and to say to
بسلام
Israel that this transfer is a
وأن
crime
خيار إما أن
that
تموت في
cannot
شمال غزة
be
أو
overlooked.
ترحل لجنوبها لتقتل
The
هنا أيضا
choice, either you die in the
هو
north of
خيار
Gaza
مرفوض
or
لن
be
يقبله
transferred to the
المجلس.
south of Gaza to be also killed over there. This
أما آن لمجلسكم الموقر أن يقول
shouldn't be a
لإسرائيل أن الحياة
choice.
الإنسانية
The council should
مقدسة
not accept this.
بغض
Isn't it time
النظر
for
عن
the council
أصلك
to say to
أو
Israel
عرقك
that human
أو
life
دينك.
is sacred regardless of someone's religion,
أما آن أن يتم حماية
ethnicity, or
منشآت
origin?
الأمم
Isn't it
المتحدة
time to protect
ومستشفيات غزة
UN
ومرافقها
facilities and the
وبنيتها
hospitals
التحتية
and infrastructure and facilities of Gaza?
وأن يستجيب
Isn't it time
المجلس
for the
لنداءات
council
مؤسسات
to
الإغاثة
heed the
الإنسانية
calls of humanitarian
والتي عبر
agencies
عنها قبل قليل
that
السيد لازاريني
Mr.
والسيدة
Lazzarini
راسل
and Ms.
والسيدة
Russell
دوتن
and Ms. Doughton
والتي تدعون
have
جميعا
so
لوقف هذه
clearly
المأساة الإنسانية
communicated to you
في غزة.
to end this humanitarian crisis in
أما آن
Gaza.
الأوان
Isn't it
لقيام
time
المجلس
for the
بتحميد إسرائيل
council
المسؤولية
to hold
القانونية
Israel legally
والجزائية
accountable
على ما ترتكبه
and
من قتل
to punish
وتطهير
Israel
عرقي
for the killing,
وجرائم
ethnic
حرب في
cleansing,
غزة
war crimes committed by Israel
مذكرين
in
أن هذه
Gaza,
الجرائم
reminding that
التي
these
ترتكب
crimes
أمام أعين
committed
المجتمع
as the
الدولي
international
يتم
community watches
توثيقها
are being
يوميا
documented
من
daily
قبل آليات
by
المحاسبة
international
الدولية.
accountability mechanisms.
أما آن
Isn't
الأوان
it
لأن
time
يطلع
for the
المجلس
Security Council to
بمسؤولياته
shoulder its
ويحترم
responsibilities and to
مبادئه
respect
ومقاصد الأمم
its
المتحدة
principles
المنصوص
and the
عليه في
purposes of the
ميثاقها
UN as set
وأن
forth
يعمل
in the
على
Charter?
إيقاف
Isn't
الحرب
it time for the
والعدوان
Council to work
وحماية
to stop
شعبنا
the
الفلسطيني في
war
غزة
and aggression
وفي
and to
جميع
protect
الأرض
our Palestinian
الفلسطينية
people in
المحتلة.
Gaza and all the occupied
هذا هو
Palestinian
حتما
territory as
خيار
well?
هذا المجلس
This is
في
the choice
مرحلة
of this Council
مفصلية
at a very
من
pivotal
تاريخ هذه
point
المنظمة.
in the history of this organization.
السيد الرئيس تجدد
Mr.
المجموعة
President,
العربية
the Arab
تأكيدها
Group
على أن السلام
reaffirms
العادل
that
والشامل
the
والدائم
just,
وفقا
comprehensive,
للمرجعيات
and lasting
المعتمدة
peace in
مبادرة السلام
accordance with the
العربية
adopted terms of
خيار
reference
هو
and
خيار
the Arab
عربي
Peace Initiative
استراتيجي
is a strategic
سبيله
Arab
الوحيد
choice. The only means
قيام الدولة
for
الفلسطينية
this
المستقلة
choice to be
ذات
implemented
السيادة
is the establishment of an
وعاصمته
independent
القدس المحتلة
Palestinian
على
state
خطوط
that
الرابع
is
من حزيران
sovereign
العام
with
1967.
occupied Jerusalem as its capital on the lines of the
السيد
4th of June
الرئيس أجدد أيضا
1967.
شكري لكافة
Mr.
الدول
President,
الأعضاء
I would
التي
like also to
صوتت
reiterate
لصالح
my
قرار
thanks to
الجمعية
all
العامة
the member states
والذي
that voted
عكس
in
موقفا
favor of
راسخا
the
بوجه
GA resolution
الازدواجية في
that
معايير تطبيق القانون
has
الدولي
been a translation of a
والتأكيد
principled
على
position
ضرورة وقف
in the
الحرب
face of double
وحماية
standards in
المدنيين
the application of
والتمسك
international law
بالالتزامات
and an
القانونية
affirmation
والإنسانية
to end war, protect
انسجاما مع
civilians
المبادئ
in
والقيم
and
التي
adhere
قامت
to
وتقوم
legal
عليها
and
هذه
humanitarian
المنظمة
obligations
وإسهاما
and in
في
line with the
تعزيز
principles and
الأمن
values that
والسلم
this
في
organization was
المنطقة والعالم.
established to uphold and
السيد الرئيس في
towards the
النهاية وقد
promotion of
أنهيت
security
كلمتي بالنيابة عن المجموعة
and
العربية
stability and
أود
peace
أن
in the region
أذكر
and
شيئا
the
واحدا
world. And now,
هنالك عبر
after
التاريخ
having concluded this statement
دول
on behalf of their
ارتكبت
group,
فظائع
I
في
would like to
بلاد
say that there
تحتلها
are
فظائع
countries
شديدة
that have committed atrocities in countries that
ولكني
they
لم
have
أسمع من
occupied.
قبل
But I have never
لدولة
ever heard
محتلة
that an
تدعي أنها
occupying
ضحية
state
كما تفعل
claim to be
إسرائيل
the
الآن.
victim, to play the victim as Israel is doing now.
شكرا سيد
I thank
الرئيس.
you, Mr. President. These remarks are in the national capacity.
I thank the permanent representative of Jordan for his statement. And the permanent representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give the floor to the permanent representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the U.S. representative in her earlier statement accused China of vetoing the draft resolution put forward by the U.S. I would like to respond to that. The U.S. representative accused China of vetoing the draft resolutions put forward by U.S. This is the most unreasonable words I have heard today. Put it simply, the United States wants China to be responsible for what's happening in Gaza today. And I have to tell the representative of the U.S. that We are not to blame for this.
美国代表应该非常
The
清楚
U.S. representative should know
中东
very
局势
well
是如何
that
发展到了今天。
should know very well how the
这个中间
situation of the
美
Middle
国到
East
底
evolved.
都做了什么？
And the U.S. representative knows the best exactly
美国代
what
表
the
也
U.S.
应该非
did
常清
in
楚，
the Middle East.
是
The U.S.
美国
representative
先
should
后否决
also
了
know
几十项
very clearly
安理会
that it is the
关
U.S.
于中东
that
和
has
巴以问题
vetoed
的决议草案，
the
导致
draft resolutions of the
安理会
Security Council on
在
Palestine and Israel, and that
中东和
led
巴以问题上
to
难以发挥
the
应有的
difficulty of the Council to
建设性
play a constructive, responsible
导致
role
安理会
on this issue.
在
And that
推
has
动落
led
实两国方案上
to
难以
the Security
有效地
Council
作
being
为。
very difficult to do anything about promoting and
美
implementing
国
the
代表也
two-state
应该清楚，
solutions. The U.S.
中
representative
国
should also be clear that
以及其他一些国
China
家为什么
as
投票
lo-
反对
together
美国
with
上
many
周
other
提出的
countries
决议草案？
opposed the U.S.
美国匆
resolution.
匆提出了一项决议
The
草案，
U.S.
在否决了巴
hastily
西
put forward
提出
the
的决议
resolution
草案
after vetoing
之后，
the
匆匆提出了
resolution put forward
美
by
方的决议
Brazil.
草案，但是
By
这项决
Brazil,
议草案完全
but
忽
the
视
U.S.
全世
draft
界，
resolution totally disregarded
特别是阿拉伯国家
the
关于停火
strong
止战的
call of
强
the
烈呼声，
entire world for ceasefire and truce,
完
especially
全混
that
淆
call from
是
the
非，
Arab countries that
试图
confused
将巴以
right
问
and
题
wrong and attempted
引入
to
另一
take
种
the
叙事轨道。
Palestine-Israel conflict to another narrative, to another path.
更危险的是，这种
What is
行为
more
将给
dangerous is
局势
this
进一步
behavior
升级
will
大开绿灯。
give a green light to the further escalation
对
of the
这样的
situation
草案，
there. For that kind of
中国
draft
完全有理
resolution,
由
China
就
has
站着
all
投
the
反对票。
reasons to
我们的投票立场
vote in opposition
基于事
to
实，
that.
基于法律，
Our
基于
position
良知，
on vote
基于正
on the
义，
vote is based on facts,
也
law,
基于来
conscience,
自
and
全世
justice.
界，
It's
特
also
别
based
是
on
广大
the
阿拉伯
strong
国家的
call
强
of the
烈呼声。
entire world, especially that of the Arab countries.
联大在随后通过的
The General Assembly
决议
later
当
on
中，
adopted that resolution.
就
And
停火止
in
战、保
that
护平民、
resolution,
避免人道主义危机，发出了十分清晰明确的信号。
send a very clear, unequivocal,
那么联大决议
unequivocal
的通过，
message for the truce
得到
and
了
stopping the fighting and
联合
prevention
国
of the humanitarian
绝
crisis
大
there.
多数会员的
And this has got
坚决
the
有力的支持。
strong and
这一
affirmative
决议的
support of the
通过，
overwhelming
证
majority
明
of
中
the
方
UN
的投票
members.
立场
This adoption
完
of the
全
GA
是
resolution
正确
is another proof that China's position is entirely
我希望
correct. I
美
hope
方呢能
that
够
the
真
US
正的
will
采取负责任的态
earnestly
度，从
adopt
安
a
理会同
responsible
源一道，
attitude and work
聚
together
焦
with
当
members
前
of the Council,
加沙局势当
focus
中所面临
on
的
the
最紧迫的
most pressing issues,
停火问题，
that is the ceasefire
保护
issue
平民
in
问题，
Gaza, that is the
提供
protection
人
of
道主义
civilians
准
issue,
入问
that
题，
is the
避免更大
humanitarian
的人道
aid, the
灾难
delivery
等
of humanitarian
问
aid,
题，
as well as the prevention of further
凝聚共识，
humanitarian catastrophe. We hope on
推
these
动安理
pressing
会
issues
尽
will
早采取
consolidate our
有意义、
consensus so that the Security
负责
Council
任的
will
行动。
take a more
谢谢。
responsible action at an early date. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of China for his statement, and the representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give the representative of the United States the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be very brief. I just want, I think as the record shows, China cast a no vote on Wednesday, October 25, on the resolution put forward by the United States. That is a fact. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.